sun had barely crested the horizon when the commotion at Rue de l'Arcade began to draw a small crowd. Paris in early spring carried a delicate chill that nipped at noses and fingers alike. Yet that morning, the usual hum of the city felt incongruously hushed, as if the streets themselves were holding their breath. The disturbance centred on the elegant, if somewhat austere, townhouse of Madame Élodie Rousseau, a widow of modest means, who had become known more for her quiet, meticulous lifestyle than any connection to scandal or crime. But as the murmurs spread, it became clear that something extraordinary had occurred within those ivy-clad walls. Inspector Delacroix was the first official to arrive, stepping over the gathering of curious onlookers who peered through the wrought-iron gates. His expression was one of cautious puzzlement. The telegram he had received had been brief but alarming. Madame Rousseau, apparent foul play. Immediate attention requested. What made it peculiar, however, was the unusual postscript. Clue left on mantel. Confounding. Such a message suggested more than a simple domestic dispute. It hinted at something calculated, almost theatrical. The interior of the house retained its sombre elegance. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, painting delicate patterns upon the polished parquet floor. Madame Rousseau herself appeared at the top of the staircase, her once dark hair now streaked with silver, dressed in a flowing morning gown that seemed inseparable from her form. Her face, pale and rigid, betrayed neither fear nor grief, but a curious composure, as though she were watching an intricate play unfold. "Inspector," she said softly, "I hardly know where to begin. It's all impossible." He nodded, motioning for her to lead the way to the drawing-room, where the heart of the mystery awaited. The room was pristine, almost antiseptically so. On the ornate fireplace mantel a single object rested, a small gilded music box. It was open, revealing a miniature ballerina poised in mid-twirl, delicate and incongruous against the otherwise sombre surroundings. Beside it a thin smear of red, scarcely noticeable unless one's attention was drawn, hinted at violence, but no other traces of blood stained the room. No sign of struggle, no forced entry. "It was here when I returned from my morning walk," Madame Rousseau said, her voice steady. "I found the music box, and my husband was gone." Inspector Delacroix circled the room, observing every detail. There were no footprints beyond the expected ones, no overturned furniture, nothing to suggest an intruder. The windows were latched from the inside. The door was locked and bolted. A puzzle. He bent closer to examine the music box. The ballerina's delicate feet were smeared with something faintly crimson, and when he pressed the spring to hear its tune, a haunting melody drifted through the room. Soft, whimsical, yet oddly mournful. "Was Monsieur Rousseau fond of this?" he asked. "Yes," she replied. "He collected them. Every year on our anniversary he would present me with a new one. But I don't understand this. He loved me. He would never leave like this. And there was no letter. Nothing. Just the music box." The inspector's gaze lingered on the red smear. He knelt and, with the precision of habit, examined it through his magnifying glass. The stain was fresh, yet, intriguingly, the box itself appeared untouched. No fingerprints beyond those of Madame Rousseau and her late husband, as far as he could tell. No forced movement, no subtle tampering. The crime, or disappearance, was locked in a perfect stillness, and that perfection was what made it so confounding. He moved to the walls, noting the delicate paintings, the subtle shadows cast by the chandeliers, the fireplace's untouched hearth. "No one could have entered without your knowledge," he murmured. "And yet—" Madame Rousseau tilted her head, as though listening to a thought that had already taken shape. "There is one thing," she said slowly. "A peculiar habit my husband had. He would always leave a note if he intended to be away, even briefly. Sometimes a cryptic one, like a puzzle. But today, nothing. Only this box. Perhaps it is his message." Delacroix straightened, intrigued. "A message, you say? Perhaps it is meant for you alone." "Or for someone else," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes were now fixed on the box, unblinking, as though it contained the sum of all answers. "I can't think of anyone who would wish him harm yet. The city is full of shadows." The inspector's trained eye shifted to the finer details. The carpet beneath the mantel bore no signs of scuffing. The fire grate was cold. But there was something odd, a faint dusting on the windowsill, as if it had been recently disturbed, and the faintest trace of a scent, almost imperceptible, floral and bittersweet. It reminded him vaguely of gardenias, yet with an undertone of something metallic, coppery. "Did he go to the garden yesterday?" he asked. "Yes," she replied. "He tends to the roses every morning. But the gate is locked from inside. There is no way to leave without someone noticing." Delacroix's brow furrowed. The logic of the scene seemed to twist around itself. A locked room, a missing man, a cryptic object hinting at communication, the musical melody, the smear of red, the faint scent, they were all pieces of a puzzle that refused to align. He sat in the high-back chair near the fireplace, letting the silence settle. Madame Rousseau watched him closely, her composure unwavering. Yet beneath her calm there was an unmistakable tension, a vigilance that suggested she feared more than just the immediate mystery. Delacroix understood that instinct. Danger often lingered unseen, even when the eyes betrayed nothing. Minutes passed before he spoke again, slow and deliberate. "Madame Rousseau, this is no ordinary disappearance. The arrangement here, the box, the absence of forced entry, all indicate planning, cunning, a mind playing with us." She nodded faintly. "And you think it is someone I know?" "Most likely," he said. "Such precision rarely comes from strangers, but the true question is why?" Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the music box. The ballerina continued her endless pirouette, as though mocking the uncertainty that enveloped the room. "Perhaps," she said softly, "he intended for me to find it. Perhaps he wanted me to solve it before—" Her voice faltered, and for a brief moment her controlled composure cracked, revealing the fragile hope and fear entwined in her grief. Delacroix leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment, allowing the mind to wander across the details that refused to yield a coherent explanation. A locked room, a single clue, a vanished man. Nothing was ordinary, yet nothing seemed forced. The simplest possibilities, the ones easiest to overlook, often concealed the most intricate truths. And here, in this sunlit room with its whispering lace and turning ballerina, the unsolvable crime had only just begun to reveal its first shadow. Outside, the city carried on, oblivious to the drama unfolding within the walls of the Rousseau townhouse. But inside, every object, every scent, every faint smear of red was alive with significance. And though the solution remained hidden, Delacroix knew that the first threads of revelation were already entwining themselves in the quiet, meticulous world of Madame Rousseau, a world that, for the moment, appeared impeccable, calm, and tragically enigmatic. The mystery, it seemed, had chosen its stage, and the players were already in place. All that remained was for the story to unfold. Delacroix rose from his chair, the music box's tinkling melody still echoing faintly in the quiet room. He walked slowly toward the French doors that led to the garden, mindful of each step, as though the polished parquet might conceal some hidden clue beneath its gleaming surface. Madame Rousseau followed, her hand lightly resting on the banister, her eyes fixed on the inspector with a mixture of apprehension and faint hope. Outside, the garden was immaculate, the roses perfectly pruned, their petals glistening with morning dew. Yet the serenity only deepened the unease. Here, in this carefully ordered space, the disruption of a man vanishing so completely seemed almost grotesque. Delacroix paused near the gate, noting its ironwork, the small padlock that secured it from the inside. It was as she had said. No ordinary escape route existed. He crouched, examining the ground for footprints, soil disturbed by hurried movement, anything that might betray a presence. The garden smelled of earth and blossoms, but beneath that lay a faint metallic tang, the same coppery note. From inside, faint but persistent, he straightened and glanced at Madame Rousseau. Did Monsieur Rousseau ever work with chemicals, or perhaps metal in his hobbies? She shook her head. Number always the roses, the music boxes. His life was simple, too simple for this. Delacroix's mind worked methodically, sorting possibilities. Simple, too simple. That was precisely the danger. A straightforward life could be a veil for subtle manipulations, or it could make an ordinary disappearance appear inexplicably complex. He stepped closer to the wrought-iron gate, his fingers brushing the surface, noting its temperature, the faint scratches near the hinge, the way the lock clicked slightly when nudged. No signs of forced tampering. If anyone had left or entered, it had been with perfect care, or with inside knowledge. Returning inside, he considered the music box once more. Its placement seemed deliberate, almost ceremonial. He leaned close to examine the ballerina's smear again, and this time he noticed something overlooked before. Tiny flecks of a peculiar powder along the edge of the mantel, near the music box. It was faint, almost invisible against the polished wood, but in the sunlight filtering through the curtains it caught a subtle glint. He carefully collected a sample, bagging it for later analysis. "This might be significant," he murmured, more to himself than to Madame Rousseau. Her eyes followed his every movement, anxiety threading through her composed demeanour. "What could it mean?" she asked. "Possibly a message or a warning," he said slowly, "or perhaps the clue itself. In cases like this, the smallest detail can carry the heaviest weight." Delacroix's attention then shifted to the mantelpiece itself, ornate yet functional, a place where objects of personal significance might be displayed. He noticed the alignment of the music box, not centered but slightly angled toward the left side of the room. Subtle, almost imperceptible, yet deliberate. He measured the angle in his mind, considering sightlines, the way someone standing at the doorway would view it, how it might guide or mislead the observer. He returned to the drawing room, pacing deliberately, replaying each action and observation. The smell, the powder, the music, the smear, all connected. Yet how, he could not immediately discern. He took a deep breath, then knelt once more to study the parquet floor near the fireplace. The polish was uniform, but faint impressions in the wood suggested recent movement, a careful shuffle, perhaps two people brushing past each other. He traced them with his gloved fingers, noting their direction, and for the first time considered a notion he had resisted. Maybe Monsieur Rousseau had left of his own volition. Could he have gone willingly? He asked softly. Madame Rousseau shook her head sharply. Number, he would not leave me. He would leave a note, always a note. Something, to puzzle me, yes, but never silence. Her gaze lingered on the music box, her hands twitching lightly. But he did love puzzles. That admission sparked a new thought in Delacroix's mind. A man who enjoyed riddles might leave a clue not as an announcement of departure, but as an invitation, a test. He examined the powder again, wondering if it could form part of a cipher, a hidden message meant for someone attuned to detail. He also noted the pattern of the ballerina's skirt, the intricate carvings of the mantel, the way the sunlight struck the delicate lace curtains. Each element could be meaningful, or it could be a diversion. The line between simplicity and deception was fine, razor sharp. He decided to extend the investigation outward beyond the confines of the room. Perhaps the answer lay not within the immediate scene, but in the routines of the household, in the life Monsieur Rousseau had led, in the people who moved within his orbit. Delacroix planned to speak with the staff, though few were employed, and to examine the music box's collection for patterns, dates, gifts, inscriptions, subtle oddities that could illuminate the present mystery. As he prepared to leave the drawing room, Madame Rousseau called softly after him, "Inspector, be careful. Whatever has happened, it is not what it seems. I feel a presence, watching, waiting." Delacroix paused, considering her words. Intuition often guided where logic alone faltered. He nodded once, not dismissively but with measured acknowledgement. "Madame Rousseau, sometimes the eyes we cannot see are the ones we must account for most carefully." He stepped into the corridor, the echo of his boots soft against the floor, the music box's haunting tune lingering behind him like a ghostly whisper. Outside, the city's routine had resumed, merchants calling their wares, horses clattering over cobblestones. But inside the Rousseau townhouse, a secret pulse remained, subtle and insistent. The pieces were moving, the game quietly progressing, and somewhere within the interwoven threads of ordinary life and careful manipulation, the truth awaited, hidden, yet beckoning. Delacroix knew that the coming hours would require patience, attention, and ingenuity. The mystery had begun not with a scream or a struggle, but with the quiet, deliberate placement of a small music box, and the faintest smear of red that had, against all odds, drawn him into a puzzle no one yet dared to speak aloud. Delacroix spent the morning moving through the narrow streets of the Marais district, retracing the networks that intersected with the Rousseau household. Each step brought him closer to the subtle heartbeat of the city, shadows stretching along cobblestones, merchants calling across the streets, servants hurrying along with baskets of bread and flowers. But his mind remained focused on the locked room, the music box, and the inexplicable absence of Monsieur Rousseau. He knew the key to unravelling the mystery lay not in the objects alone, but in the voices that surrounded them, voices capable of concealment, exaggeration, or outright deceit. His first meeting was with the housekeeper, Madame Lefebvre, a woman of formidable presence despite her slight frame. She was seated in the kitchen, hands folded neatly on her apron, eyes alert but guarded. Delacroix observed her carefully, the way she shifted, the way her fingers drummed lightly on the wooden table, each motion suggesting controlled tension. "Madame Lefebvre," he began, "tell me about yesterday morning. Did you see Monsieur Rousseau before he disappeared?" The woman's eyes flickered, a trace of something unspoken passing over her face. "Yes, Inspector," she said, her voice steady. "He was in the garden at dawn, as usual, tending the roses. I delivered his tea, and he seemed thoughtful, distracted even, but no one could have imagined what was to come." Delacroix inclined his head. "Did anyone visit the house yesterday? Any deliveries, neighbours, acquaintances?" Madame Lefebvre hesitated. "A delivery, yes. From Monsieur Duval, the florist. He arrived mid-morning, but—" She paused, frowning slightly. "Nothing unusual, I assure you. Merely roses." "Merely roses?" Delacroix echoed, noting the slight rigidity in her tone. "You hesitate." She looked away, tightly pressing her lips. "Perhaps it seemed odd to me. He received an envelope with the flowers. I did not see him open it. Perhaps it contained instructions. I cannot say." Delacroix made a careful note. An envelope unseen, delivered with flowers. Innocuous, yet, in such cases, the simplest gestures often contained hidden significance. He thanked her and moved next to the gardener, a man named Henri, young and nervous, whose hands bore the stubborn stains of soil and sap. Henri's account was equally precise, but there was an eagerness in his speech as if he hoped to impress the inspector with every detail. "I saw Monsieur Rousseau, sir, in the garden, yes. He was checking the roses, touching each petal, humming quietly. He seemed content." His voice rose slightly with each word, betraying tension despite his effort to appear casual. Then I heard the music box play from inside the house. I thought maybe he had wound it himself. I didn't see anyone else, I swear it." Delacroix listened carefully, noting the contradictions between the housekeeper's quiet uncertainty and the gardener's insistence. The music box had been in the drawing room, yet Henri implied he had heard it from outside, suggesting either a lapse in perception or a deliberate embellishment. The inspector filed it away. Discrepancies, even minor ones, were rarely accidental. Next came the neighbour, Madame Fournier, who lived across the narrow lane and was known for her keen sense of observation, and her propensity for gossip. She was impeccably dressed with an air of genteel curiosity, and she spoke with dramatic flair. "I saw him, yes, that morning," she declared, leaning forward. "He left his house just after dawn, carrying a small case, quite secretive. He looked anxious, almost afraid. He glanced back several times as if someone was following. I cannot imagine who. Oh, Paris is full of thieves and ruffians, Inspector. Surely he knew danger." Delacroix's brow furrowed. "A small case? You are certain?" "Absolutely certain," she insisted. "It was dark, leather-bound. He clasped it tightly. Then he disappeared behind the Rue des Rosiers. I could not follow." The inspector noted her certainty but remained sceptical. No mention of a case had come from anyone inside the household. Either Madame Fournier had seen something entirely different, or she had misinterpreted a trivial object. Still, He recorded her account carefully. Even errors, when consistent with human perception, could reveal hidden truths. By midday, Delacroix had begun to notice a pattern. Each witness offered a version of events coloured by their personal perspective, yet each narrative introduced subtle contradictions. Madame Lefebvre hinted at unseen correspondence. Henri insisted on details that seemed irrelevant, perhaps an unconscious attempt to appear useful. Madame Fournier added elements of drama, possibly to impress or to sensationalize. The disparate voices wove a tapestry of truth and deception, with gaps that demanded scrutiny. He returned to the Rousseau house to confront the widow herself, sensing that her calm exterior might conceal reactions crucial to his investigation. She was seated in the drawing-room, tending to one of the smaller music boxes from her husband's collection, her fingers moving over it with delicate precision. Delacroix noted her steady hands, the controlled rhythm, the careful attention, evidence of someone accustomed to masks and observation. "Madame Rousseau," he began gently, "I've spoken to those who saw him yesterday. There are inconsistencies, minor contradictions. Perhaps you can clarify them. Was there a case? Did Monsieur Rousseau receive a letter?" She paused, her hand stilling over the music box. "A case? No, none that I saw. A letter? Perhaps. But if so, it was never shown to me. Everything he did was precise, never careless." Her voice carried a quiet intensity, betraying the effort to maintain composure. "Do you know if he had enemies?" Delacroix asked, watching her closely. "Anyone who might wish to deceive, frighten, or harm him." She shook her head slowly. "Enemies? He was a gentleman, Inspector, but one cannot know what lies beneath the polite facades of neighbours and acquaintances. Sometimes the smallest resentment, the tiniest slight, can fester into something terrible." Delacroix considered her words carefully. The emphasis on appearances, on the impossibility of malice, struck him as deliberate. He filed the thought away. Sometimes those who appeared most calm and trusting held the most intricate deceptions. Later, he questioned the local florist, Monsieur Duval, whose delivery had been mentioned by the housekeeper. The man was brisk, efficient, yet visibly nervous under scrutiny. "The roses were for Madame Rousseau, yes," he said, "but the envelope, it was peculiar. I cannot open them, of course. I merely placed them by the door as instructed." "Did you notice anything unusual in Monsieur Rousseau's demeanour?" Delacroix pressed. Duval swallowed. "He seemed distracted, anxious. He paid no attention to me, barely acknowledged my presence. Yet he laughed at something, though I could not hear what. Perhaps he knew something we do not." As the inspector stepped into the corridor, he realized the threads were becoming more tangled. Each witness, whether eager, guarded, or dramatic, introduced layers of ambiguity. A note unseen, a case that may or may not have existed, the music box's melody, and the faint red smear. They all converged upon a central mystery, but the human elements added complications that threatened to mislead even the most disciplined mind. Returning to the drawing-room, Delacroix allowed himself a moment to reflect. The puzzle was no longer merely the disappearance or the locked room. It was the network of motives, perceptions, and half-truths surrounding it. Each voice contained fragments of reality, distorted by fear, loyalty, self-interest, or simple error. And somewhere amid these contradictions, the truth awaited, patiently hidden, its contours just beginning to emerge. Madame Rousseau watched him quietly, the music box now silent. "Do you think," she asked softly, "that they are hiding something? That they know more than they say?" "Perhaps," he admitted, "but not everyone conceals consciously. Some truths are veiled by their own perceptions, by what they believe to be significant or insignificant. We must disentangle intention from accident, exaggeration from fact. Only then will the pattern reveal itself." The inspector knew that the coming hours would be crucial. Voices, he realized, were like threads in a labyrinth. Each had to be traced with care, each contradiction examined and weighed. A single misstep could lead him astray, yet the discipline of observation and the patient scrutiny of subtle inconsistencies might illuminate what had seemed impossible, and in the quiet elegance of the Rousseau household, amid the faint scent of roses and the distant ghostly echo of a ballerina's pirouette. The game was moving, slowly, inexorably toward revelation. Delacroix returned to the Rousseau house that evening, the sun dipping behind the slate rooftops and casting long, anxious shadows across the narrow streets. The garden was now quiet, its roses glinting faintly in the soft light, their fragrance thickening the air with a heady sweetness. Inside, the drawing-room felt almost oppressive in its stillness. The ballerina of the music box remained frozen mid-spin on the mantel, the faint traces of red still catching the last rays of daylight. Delacroix knew that to untangle the mystery, he had to move beyond the mere chronology of events and confront the human heart of the case, the motives that might drive one of these seemingly ordinary people to extraordinary acts. He began by listing the principal figures he had already spoken with, reviewing each account meticulously. Madame Lefebvre, the housekeeper, had been hesitant, cautious, and precise, but her admission that an envelope had been delivered and left unseen suggested more than simple oversight. Henri, the gardener, had insisted on details that seemed peripheral, yet his eagerness betrayed a subtle desire to control the narrative, to shape the story around himself. Madame Fournier, ever dramatic, hinted at anxiety and shadows lurking in the streets, a small case carried by the missing man, yet her account differed starkly from the others. And Monsieur Duval, the florist, hinted at knowledge just beyond his reach, a glimpse of awareness that spoke of fear and hesitation. Each had a thread, and each thread might connect to a deeper, hidden purpose. Greed, Delacroix considered, was often the simplest motive. Madame Lefebvre, loyal as she appeared, might have had access to the house's valuables, the collection of music boxes, perhaps even letters or documents with monetary significance. Yet she had been meticulous and careful, her demeanour unshakable in the face of questioning. Could greed alone explain the subtle misdirection? He made a note, but kept it tentative. Jealousy, too, could shape behaviour in ways unpredictable and sharp-edged. Henri, young and eager, might have resented the quiet authority of Monsieur Rousseau, the way his eyes lingered on the widow's composure, the respect she commanded. Youth, ambition, suppressed emotion, these were fertile grounds for small acts of defiance that could escalate. Yet Henri's nervous energy, his insistence on being seen as helpful, suggested he sought approval rather than confrontation. Still, Delacroix could not dismiss the undercurrent of envy in those carefully measured words. Revenge, Delacroix noted, was perhaps the most seductive motive of all, for it suggested knowledge of past wrongs and the desire for correction. Madame Fournier, with her keen observation and dramatized account, might have seen, or believed she saw, transgressions between the Rousseaus and some shadowed figure in the neighbourhood. Was her vivid memory of a small leather case an embellishment born of imagination, or a piece of deliberate deception? In matters of revenge, the line between perceived grievance and actual grievance blurred, and the inspector knew he must tread carefully. Fear, however, was the most insidious motivator. Monsieur Duval's hesitations, the nervous flicker of his eyes when asked about the envelope, suggested he had seen something, or believed he had, that he dared not reveal. Fear could conceal guilt, or simply the perception of it. Delacroix leaned back, letting the complexity settle in his mind. Each motive intertwined with the others, creating a labyrinth of possibilities that defied linear explanation. He decided to test the alibis, beginning with Madame Lefebvre. "Yesterday morning," he asked gently, "you delivered Monsieur Rousseau's tea and observed him in the garden. Did anyone else come near the house while you were outside?" She shook her head, lips tight. "No, Inspector, none that I saw. But the street is narrow. Someone could have passed without my noticing. I cannot claim certainty." Delacroix noted her careful wording. "And the envelope? Do you recall its contents, or who it was from?" Her hands pressed together. "I did not see the contents. I cannot say. I merely left it where he instructed." Her tone was firm, but there was the faintest tremor in her voice. Was it guilt, anxiety, or a subtle attempt to shield herself from suspicion? Henri, when questioned again, provided a more complicated picture. "I was tending the far end of the garden," he said, "so I did not see anyone approach. But I heard faint footsteps near the gate, though I thought it the wind. Perhaps someone left something. I do not know. I only know what I saw. His eyes darted toward the inspector, pleading with him to trust his account, yet betraying uncertainty. Delacroix recorded it carefully, recognizing that uncertainty could either conceal truth or fabricate it entirely. Madame Fournier's account grew more theatrical when revisited, and Delacroix sensed the thin veneer of drama masking a hidden calculation. "I saw him carrying a case," she insisted, her fingers tightening around the edge of her chair. "A dark leather case. Surely something of importance." "Perhaps it was imagined," Delacroix suggested lightly, her lips pressed into a firm line. "No, Inspector, I saw it. But perhaps it was not what it seemed. One can never know, can one?" Her eyes glimmered with a subtle defiance, a protective instinct that guarded more than just memory. It shielded motive. Monsieur Duval, for his part, admitted only to delivering the roses and the envelope. "I did not see him open it. I only placed it as instructed. Perhaps it contained something important. Perhaps it did not. I do not know. I am not involved. I swear it." The repetition of his denial, the insistence on distance, suggested either true innocence or practiced avoidance. As the inspector compared the testimonies, patterns emerged, though they were subtle and tangled. Madame Lefebvre's access and composure suggested opportunity. Henri's youthful energy hinted at ambition or suppressed resentment. Madame Fournier's theatrical observations indicated a sharp mind attuned to detail and capable of manipulation. Duval's hesitance betrayed caution, perhaps, self-preservation, perhaps fear of exposure. Each carried motive, opportunity, and the potential for misdirection. Delacroix began charting the connections mentally. The envelope could be pivotal, possibly the seed of action, whether benign or malicious. The music box, its red smear, and the faint powder hinted at a signal or message, an object designed to draw attention, to mislead, or to communicate. Every motive now intersected with these objects, creating a web of deception in which truth and falsehood were inextricably bound. He returned to the drawing-room late that evening, letting the lamplight fall over the mantel and the music box. Madame Rousseau was seated in her usual place, her eyes following him. "The motives," she murmured. "They are tangled, Inspector. Each person, each has a reason, yet none alone explains what has happened." Delacroix nodded. "Indeed, that is precisely the difficulty. In cases like this, the puzzle is never singular. The human heart is complex, and the reasons for action rarely simple. We must disentangle greed from fear, jealousy from loyalty, perception from reality. Only then can the hidden path emerge." He examined the collection of music boxes once more, noting dates, inscriptions, subtle variations in style and placement. Each object might carry a private significance, a hint or signal only decipherable to those attuned. And then there was the envelope, its contents unknown, yet potentially central to understanding why someone might act, or why the disappearance had occurred. Outside, the night deepened, carrying with it the murmur of the city and the faint whisper of wind through the roses. Inside, the shadows lengthened, stretching across polished floors and delicate lace, weaving around the secrets and motives of all who had touched this scene. Delacroix knew that the next steps would require careful scrutiny, the patient unravelling of contradictions, and a keen attention to the subtle alignments of human desire and action. The labyrinth of motives was vast, but every thread, every half-truth, every hesitation, every carefully concealed glance was a step closer to illumination. He leaned against the mantel, considering the network of human emotion and calculation laid bare before him. Each suspect had a reason, yet no single theory explained the whole. Greed, jealousy, revenge, and fear had intersected, creating a mosaic of potential culpability. Somewhere within this maze the path to truth waited, intricate and concealed, yet inevitable for the one patient enough to follow it. The inspector's mind worked relentlessly, sorting, weighing, connecting, as the night pressed on and the house, silent yet vigilant, held its secrets in the delicate balance of shadow and light. Delacroix had spent the better part of 2 days weaving through the intricate web of testimonies, alibis, and subtle clues, yet the solution remained elusive. Then, late in the morning of the third day, a breakthrough arrived, though, as he would soon realize, it was far more deceptive than genuine. The missing envelope, so central to the investigation, had been recovered. It had been found hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the back hall, tucked away with such care that only the most meticulous search could have revealed it. Delacroix had insisted on a second sweep of the house, one that scrutinized every crevice, every overlooked angle, and in the moment it was discovered, it seemed the culmination of his patient work. He carefully extracted it, noting the slight curling of the paper, the faint scent of roses and ink. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable. Monsieur Rousseau's. The seal had been broken, and the folded letter inside revealed words that seemed to promise clarity, a detailed account of his intentions to leave the city for a private matter, instructions for the care of his beloved widow, and an explanation of a minor dispute with a business associate that might have provoked worry among his acquaintances. The content was meticulous, polite, and, on the surface, entirely plausible. Authorities were swift to act. Within hours, the local press had begun reporting the resolution of the Rousseau disappearance, citing the envelope as proof that Monsieur Rousseau had merely left of his own accord, for reasons entirely unconnected to foul play. Headlines proclaimed a comforting conclusion. The case had been solved. The mystery explained. Madame Rousseau maintained her dignified composure for the cameras, though Delacroix noticed a subtle tension beneath her serene facade, a fleeting tightening of the jaw, a flicker in her eyes as she greeted the officials. And yet, despite the apparent triumph, Delacroix felt a nagging unease he could not dismiss. Something about the scenario felt orchestrated, too tidy, too carefully designed to resolve itself neatly. The envelope's placement beneath the floorboard seemed contrived. Its contents, while plausible, addressed questions that had not yet been asked. It was as though the letter anticipated the investigation, a preemptive narrative crafted to close the case before the true complexity of events could surface. He returned to the drawing-room in solitude, moving quietly among the familiar furnishings. The music box on the mantel still rested where it had always been, ballerina frozen mid-spin, faint traces of red smeared across its tiny feet. Delacroix examined it closely once again, noting the minuscule flecks of powder he had collected days before. They had been sent for analysis, but preliminary reports indicated nothing immediately revealing, merely traces of common metallic compounds, not inconsistent with the household's maintenance routines. Yet the combination of elements, the red smear, the powder, the letter, suggested deliberate placement. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to craft a narrative, one that would appear complete to any casual observer. Delacroix's instincts, honed through years of observing human behavior, told him that this was a false victory. Real criminals often staged such apparent resolutions, planting evidence to divert attention, to lull investigators into complacency. He could not ignore the possibility that Monsieur Rousseau's disappearance had been engineered, and that the true perpetrator remained at large, hidden behind layers of expectation and social propriety. Determined to test the integrity of the envelope, Delacroix retraced its path from floorboard to the drawing-room. He considered who had access, who might have had the knowledge to anticipate the investigation, and who could manipulate the objects and observations so subtly. Madame Lefebvre's controlled demeanour and intimate knowledge of the household were possibilities, yet her hesitance over the delivery hinted at genuine concern rather than deliberate deception. Henri, the gardener, remained a variable. Youthful eagerness could easily mask fear or overconfidence. Madame Fournier's dramatic tendencies made her difficult to predict, but her proximity to the street suggested she had at least the opportunity to observe movements outside the house. Delacroix returned to questioning with renewed intensity, focusing not on the superficial explanations offered by the envelope, but on inconsistencies in the witnesses' accounts. Madame Lefebvre insisted she had placed the envelope as instructed, but no one could confirm that Monsieur Rousseau had seen it. Henri's recollection of footsteps near the gate seemed almost rehearsed, as if designed to align with the narrative emerging from the letter. Madame Fournier's insistence on a leather case remained unexplained, a detail that neither the recovered envelope nor the official resolution could reconcile. As he moved through the house, Delacroix noticed subtle details he had overlooked in the excitement of the apparent breakthrough. The lock on the garden gate, though intact, bore faint impressions along its surface, suggesting handling by someone practiced in subtle manipulation. The curtains, drawn slightly to one side, had shifted imperceptibly, as though someone had observed the drawing room from outside. Even the music box, carefully wound, retained the faintest smudge on its base that did not match any known fingerprints. Each element hinted at an unseen hand, an observer orchestrating events from the shadows. He also considered the behaviour of Madame Rousseau herself. Her outward composure was impressive, but Delacroix had noticed micro-expressions, the briefest tightening of her lips, a shadow of concern in her eyes, a momentary pause as she glanced at the fireplace. She had reason to hide knowledge, but of what? Was she protecting someone, or herself? Or was she too being manipulated by an unseen force? The answers were elusive, but the tension in her subtle reactions suggested layers of understanding beyond what the authorities had acknowledged. By late afternoon, Delacroix convened a quiet review of all evidence, ignoring the proclamations of his colleagues. The recovered envelope, while convincing to the uninformed, left too many questions unresolved. The placement of the music box, the powder, the smear of red, the inconsistencies among witnesses, none of it fit neatly into the narrative the authorities had accepted. The case, he realized, was far from concluded. The inspector spent hours tracing lines of opportunity and motive, cross-referencing the statements, searching for connections between subtle gestures, timelines, and objects. He noted that the sequence of events suggested careful orchestration, and yet, crucially, no one had been observed leaving or entering the house in a way that accounted for all anomalies. He suspected someone with intimate knowledge of the household had staged the evidence to create the illusion of closure, anticipating the investigators' responses. As night fell, Delacroix stood once more in the drawing room, the city outside cloaked in shadow. The ballerina remained motionless, the red smear still faintly glinting in the lamplight. He considered the implications. The authorities believed the matter resolved, the narrative complete, but the real criminal was still unaccounted for. Someone was watching, waiting, allowing the investigators to settle into complacency before making their next move. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, every silent corner a potential hiding place for the truth. He finally leaned against the mantel, closing his eyes briefly. The illusion of victory could be dangerous. It encouraged mistakes, lulled the unwary into inattention. Delacroix understood that patience, vigilance, and careful observation were essential. Only by resisting the lure of apparent resolution could he hope to reveal the reality hidden beneath layers of artifice and subtle manipulation. The false victory had been claimed, the case publicly solved, and yet Delacroix felt a shiver of certainty. The real culprit remained in the shadows, calculating the moment to strike again, shaping the narrative with patience and precision. He could sense it in the delicate balance of objects, in the micro-expressions of witnesses, in the lingering tension of the house itself. The game was far from over. Outside, the city carried on, unaware of the intricacies unfolding behind the doors of the Rousseau household. Inside, Delacroix's mind worked tirelessly, sifting truth from deception, motive from misdirection, opportunity from artifice. The envelope might have offered reassurance to the public, but the detective knew the danger had only deepened. The real story, he sensed, was only just beginning, and the shadows were watching, patient, cunning, and ready to move when least expected. Delacroix returned to the Rousseau house the following morning with a sense of renewed focus. The false victory of the recovered envelope still hung heavily. In his mind, a reminder that appearances could deceive even the most careful observer. He had spent the night reviewing his notes, comparing witness statements, timelines, and the peculiar details of the music boxes, and it was a small, easily overlooked detail that now drew his attention, a faded, almost imperceptible watermark on the recovered envelope. At first, he had dismissed it as insignificant, a manufacturer's mark, a routine flourish of stationery. But upon closer inspection in the morning light, The mark appeared to correspond with a small emblem he remembered from a long-forgotten case from years earlier, a case involving a minor fraud ring, a series of subtle manipulations and threats among Parisian households, which had never been fully resolved. The connection was tenuous, yet compelling. The emblem was rare, used primarily by a specific supplier of personalized stationery favored by affluent households. Delacroix felt a chill of anticipation. If the stationery had a link to that old case, perhaps the methods or even the culprits were connected. He pulled the records from his memory, recalling names, associations, and minor grievances from the fraud investigation. One name stood out, Henri Duval, not the florist, but the father of the current Duval, who had been implicated indirectly in minor manipulations of affluent clients, never fully prosecuted, but carefully monitored. Could there be a familial connection? Had patterns of subtle deceit carried across generations, now culminating in the disappearance of Monsieur Rousseau? He requested a quiet audience with Madame Rousseau, careful not to reveal his full line of thought, knowing that disclosure might trigger defensive or misleading responses. She met him in the drawing room, serene yet watchful, tending to one of the smaller music boxes. "Madame Rousseau," Delacroix began, "I have been reviewing minor details, things that may seem irrelevant. I wonder if you might recall any past disputes or interactions your late husband may have had with the Duval family, or others connected to the neighborhood. Even trivial incidents can become significant." She paused, lips pressed lightly together. "With the Duvals?" she repeated softly, a faint glimmer of memory in her eyes. There were always minor tensions, yes. Monsieur Rousseau was fastidious about the roses, the streets, the order of deliveries. Henri's father. He was persistent in his solicitations, though nothing major ever came of it. Only whispers, polite refusals, minor misunderstandings. "But you think this could be relevant?" Delacroix nodded slowly. Sometimes the smallest, most forgotten grievances can leave lasting traces, patterns repeated by those who follow in their predecessors' footsteps. Old habits die hard. He spent the day revisiting each witness, guided by the possibility that familial connections and old disputes might reveal hidden alliances or shared motives. Henri, the young gardener, remained outwardly nervous, but Delacroix now scrutinized every hesitation, every subtle inflection. Henri admitted that his father had occasionally visited the Rousseau household years prior, offering advice on deliveries and horticulture, often pressing his influence in minor, persistent ways. Though dismissed at the time, these visits now suggested a faint thread of influence that might explain access, timing, or motivation. The housekeeper, Madame Lefebvre, provided additional insights. "I remember Monsieur Duval's father. A stern man," she said carefully. "He was polite, always offering recommendations, but there was a weight to his presence. My memory may not be perfect, but I believe he once left an envelope at the house himself, under circumstances that seemed trivial then. A note, a small instruction. I did not think it significant, but perhaps—" Her voice trailed, the uncertainty in her tone betraying more than her words. Delacroix filed these details meticulously. Connections were emerging, faint and subtle, between the Duvals and the Rousseau household, threads that had been nearly invisible against the backdrop of daily life. He began to sketch a web, linking the father's minor influence, Henri's access and awareness, and the recent delivery of roses with the envelope. What had once appeared as isolated interactions now formed a continuum: influence, access, subtle pressure, repeated over years, now intersecting with the present crisis. Madame Fournier, too, provided an unexpected contribution. She recalled events from several years ago, mentioning the quiet comings and goings of certain individuals in the neighborhood, occasional meetings on the street, hushed conversations that had seemed irrelevant but now gained context. "I did not think it mattered at the time," she said, "but now, with everything, it seems curious that some of the same names recur: Duval, Lefebvre, and others I cannot place." Her observations, dramatic yet accurate, filled in gaps that had previously been dismissed as trivial. Delacroix began to perceive a pattern. The crime was not an isolated act of opportunity, but rather the culmination of long-standing dynamics, layered with generational influence and interpersonal histories. The envelope, the music box, the faint powder, the smear of red, all could now be interpreted within a broader framework of subtly orchestrated pressure, familial influence, and repeated behavioral patterns. The disappearance of Monsieur Rousseau was no random act. It had roots buried deep in past interactions, in overlooked grievances, and minor manipulations repeated and intensified over time. He revisited the music boxes themselves, examining inscriptions, dates, and gifts with renewed attention. Certain pieces, he realized, had been purchased or presented during years when the elder Duval had been actively involved with the household, hinting at subtle signals embedded in objects, perhaps to communicate intentions or create expectations. The objects became not mere ornaments, but markers, part of an ongoing pattern of influence and control. As night fell over the city, Delacroix returned to the drawing-room for reflection. The room was silent, the soft glow of lamps illuminating the intricate carvings of the furniture, the polished parquet, the faint traces of red on the music box. He considered the web he had uncovered: generational influence, repeated minor grievances, hidden alliances, and subtle manipulation of objects and observations. The present crisis was the inevitable result of past actions and decisions, intertwined over years in a delicate lattice of cause and effect. Madame Rousseau, sensing his introspection, spoke softly. "So, the disappearance. It is not merely about now. It is about the past, is it not?" Delacroix nodded. "Indeed. Sometimes the roots of a crime extend far deeper than we initially perceive. Actions, even seemingly trivial ones, can reverberate across time, shaping motives, alliances, and opportunities in ways the present only begins to reveal. The past, Madame Rousseau, often casts the longest shadow." He felt the weight of this realization. The investigation could no longer focus solely on immediate actions or apparent evidence. It had to consider historical context, repeated influences, and patterns that had persisted unnoticed. The criminal, he now understood, had exploited not only the vulnerabilities of the present, but the accumulated subtleties of the past, blending opportunity with anticipation, weaving a complex narrative that appeared orderly until examined in detail. As he prepared to leave for the night, Delacroix resolved to dig deeper into historical connections, minor grievances, and long-standing interactions among the household and its associates. Each overlooked detail, each faint memory or minor act might now hold critical significance. The crime was not merely a singular event, it was the product of years of human behavior, subtle manipulation, and hidden pressures that had finally reached a tipping point. Outside, the streets of Paris lay quiet beneath a velvet sky, the distant clatter of a carriage echoing faintly. Inside, the Rousseau house seemed to breathe with anticipation, as if aware of the truths that were only now beginning to surface. Delacroix understood that the investigation had entered a new phase. The shadows of the past had emerged as guiding forces, linking suspects in unexpected ways and revealing a depth of planning and influence that no single contemporary motive could explain. The detective knew that in unraveling the threads of this intricate web, he would confront not only the actions of the present, but the lingering echoes of history itself. The crime was no longer just a puzzle of disappearance and deception. It was a story written across time, its roots intertwined with generations, its resolution demanding patience, insight, and an unerring attention to the faintest traces of human behavior. The game, he realized, was far from over, and the shadows of the past were now as vital to understanding the mystery as the evidence of the present. Delacroix returned to the Rousseau house with a quiet sense of determination. The false victory of the recovered envelope had temporarily misled the authorities, but he knew better. The web of past grievances, subtle manipulations, and carefully hidden motives demanded an approach beyond simple questioning or observational scrutiny. He needed an unconventional tactic, a method capable of cutting through the layers of deception and hesitation that each witness and suspect had meticulously maintained. The morning was grey and still, the city muted beneath a shroud of mist. Delacroix first gathered the household in the drawing-room under a pretense of reviewing the music box collection, a setting that would feel familiar and non-threatening, yet allowed him to observe reactions closely. Madame Rousseau sat near the mantel, composed, her hands lightly resting on a music box she had selected at random. Henri, the young gardener, lingered near the window, anxious but attempting to appear casual. Madame Lefebvre, poised and observant, stood close by, her eyes flicking subtly between Delacroix and the others. Rather than confronting anyone with direct questions, Delacroix decided to employ a psychological tactic he had found useful in prior investigations. He would introduce a minor, controlled inaccuracy, and observe the responses. Subtle, easily deniable contradictions often prompted instinctive reactions in those attempting to conceal the truth. He began examining one of the larger music boxes on the table, speaking aloud in a conversational tone. "Interesting," he mused, turning the delicate object in his hands. "This piece is marked 1827, though I could swear it was presented to the household a year later, in 1828, by Monsieur Duval's father. Curious. The inscriptions almost contradict the date." Henri stiffened noticeably, a slight tightening around his eyes, though he tried to maintain composure. Madame Lefebvre's hands clasped more firmly together, and Madame Rousseau gave a fleeting glance toward the inspector, her lips pressed in a faint line, as if absorbing and calculating the observation. "Do you see," Delacroix continued casually, "how even the smallest errors in memory can mislead the observer? Sometimes an incorrect assumption can reveal far more than a direct question ever could." He allowed the silence to stretch, observing each individual. Henri shifted slightly, attempting to occupy a more confident posture, yet his nervous energy betrayed him. Delacroix took careful note of the subtle cues, the way Henri's gaze flicked toward the corner of the room, the faint flush on his cheeks, the micro-movement of his hands brushing against the edge of a chair. Small, human gestures, but in a case like this, they were telling. Then Delacroix employed the second part of his tactic, an indirect test of knowledge. He casually mentioned an element of the house that had not been publicly noted. "You know," he said, "I find it intriguing that someone might use an old envelope hidden beneath a floorboard to mislead an investigator. Not the most difficult trick, but effective if one knows the habits of those observing. Curious that the choice of placement would be so precise, as though guided by prior experience." Henri's eyes widened imperceptibly and he coughed lightly, a gesture meant to mask his reaction. Delacroix allowed a few moments to pass, watching Henri's gaze drop to the floor, then rise quickly to meet his own. The young man's composure was fraying, just slightly, the careful veneer of innocence cracking along one narrow line. "Indeed," Delacroix continued, ignoring Henri's subtle shift, "it reminds me of other cases where small details, trifles really, could betray intentions. A mark on a table, a mislaid item, a faint smudge. Often, the most mundane objects carry the greatest significance, especially when someone wishes to appear ordinary while orchestrating complex outcomes." It was then that Henri, unable to contain himself further, spoke, his voice quiet but edged with unease. I did not place the envelope myself," he admitted, the words slipping out despite his effort to appear detached. "But someone showed me how it might be used. I only followed instructions." Delacroix nodded slowly, letting the confession hang in the air. He did not press immediately, allowing the implications to settle with the others in the room. Madame Lefebvre's posture stiffened, a faint flash of recognition, or perhaps concern, passing across her face. Madame Rousseau's hands tightened around her music box, the composure in her eyes only partially concealing the flicker of tension beneath. "Instructions?" Delacroix asked lightly, leaning back against the mantel. "From whom, Henri?" The young man swallowed audibly, his gaze dropping. I cannot say. It was someone older, someone I trusted." He paused, the confession faltering, then continued with a reluctant clarity. "They told me exactly where to place it, how it should appear. I did not know the contents. I thought it would mislead investigators. I did not mean harm." The revelation was subtle, yet crucial. Henri's admission exposed a layer of orchestration he had previously concealed, linking him to a guiding influence with knowledge of both the household and the investigative process. Delacroix noted the precision. The envelope had been placed not as a spontaneous act, but according to deliberate instructions, reflecting both planning and an understanding of investigative habits. Delacroix's attention turned toward Madame Lefebvre. She had remained largely silent, her hands clasped, her posture poised. Yet now, with Henri's confession, he observed a flicker of tension cross her otherwise controlled demeanour. He pressed lightly, testing for further cracks in the facade. "Madame Lefebvre," he said gently, "you have observed much over the years. Surely you have noticed when someone is following instructions not their own, perhaps even someone guiding another to act on their behalf." Her lips pressed together, and a subtle exhale betrayed the slightest tremor. I have observed peculiar behaviours," she admitted, her voice steady but cautious. "Yet in households like this, discretion is essential. One does not interfere lightly." Her admission, so measured and constrained, suggested awareness without culpability, but the recognition alone indicated that she, too, had been aware of the orchestration, even if she had not actively participated. Delacroix now had the key he had been seeking, confirmation that the envelope's placement was guided and that someone beyond Henri had orchestrated its appearance. The psychological tactic, the subtle introduction of an inaccuracy and indirect observation, had revealed the first tangible fracture in the carefully maintained facade. He allowed the moment to settle, observing how the room's atmosphere shifted. Henri remained nervous, relieved perhaps at having confessed in a controlled setting rather than being caught in a direct confrontation. Madame Lefebvre's awareness was quiet, almost imperceptible, but significant. Madame Rousseau's composure remained intact, yet Delacroix suspected that beneath the surface calculations were being made, alliances and possibilities reassessed. "This is why," Delacroix said finally, speaking to the group with a calm authority, "one must observe not only what is said, but how it is said. Not only what is done, but how it is done. The subtleties, the instincts, the reactions, they all carry meaning. In this case, the simplest action, a placement of an envelope, reveals an orchestrator hidden in the shadows, guiding events with precision." Henri nodded, trembling slightly. I understand, Inspector. I only did as instructed. I should not have spoken before." Delacroix's mind raced with possibilities. The admission had narrowed the field of orchestrators significantly, exposing the unseen hand behind the apparent simplicity of the crime. Yet he knew that revealing too much now could push the true culprit further into concealment. Patience, once again, was essential. He would continue to observe, to test, to probe, not with direct accusation, but through subtle influence and carefully measured psychological pressure. As the group dispersed, Delacroix lingered by the mantel, examining the ballerina music box once more. The cracks in Henri's deception, faint yet undeniable, had illuminated the presence of another layer of control, another mind orchestrating events from the shadows. The investigation, he realized, had entered a new phase, one in which the truth would emerge not through overt confrontation, but through the careful manipulation of perception, observation, and human instinct. Outside, the city pulsed with its usual quiet rhythm, oblivious to the unfolding revelations within the Rousseau house. Inside, Delacroix understood that the unconventional tactic, simple, indirect, psychological, had provided the first true insight into the architecture of deception. The shadows had begun to yield their secrets, and for the first time, the detective could glimpse the contours of the hidden mind guiding this intricate, multi-layered plot. Delacroix had begun to feel a cautious optimism. Henri's admission of following instructions had opened a pathway into the hidden orchestration behind Monsieur Rousseau's disappearance. The pieces of the puzzle, once scattered and tangled, were beginning to hint at a coherent pattern. Yet, as he walked through the drawing-room that morning, the familiar sense of unease settled over him like a shroud. Something, he could feel it, was about to disrupt the fragile momentum he had built. It was the study that first betrayed the shift. The room had been untouched since his last visit, yet now the small writing desk in the corner appeared subtly altered. The papers he had meticulously catalogued were gone. The envelope that had once been tucked beneath the floorboard, now carefully preserved under glass, was missing. In its place lay a faint smear of ink, as if someone had attempted to erase evidence in haste. Delacroix knelt, examining the polished surface. The impressions of handwriting, nearly invisible, suggested that the papers had been removed deliberately, not by accident or negligence. The theft was subtle, precise. Whoever had done this understood the significance of the evidence, knew the detective's methods well enough to anticipate which items would attract his attention. The letter, the minor documents detailing prior grievances, and Henry's detailed account, all had vanished. Only the faint traces of ink remained, a taunting reminder that someone was actively working to prevent discovery. Delacroix's mind raced as he retraced his steps over the past 24 hours. Who had access to the study? Madame Rousseau, certainly, but her demeanour remained unshaken, and she had no history of deception. Madame Lefebvre had the household knowledge and access, yet her prior careful conduct suggested she was motivated by discretion rather than subterfuge. Henri, young and impressionable, could not have removed the evidence without drawing suspicion. The list narrowed quickly, yet the level of precision suggested a practised hand. He summoned Henri quietly, outside the scrutiny of the other household members. The young man's nervous energy was almost tangible. "Henri," Delacroix said gently, "was anyone alone in the study yesterday aside from yourself?" Henri swallowed. "No, Wait. There was a visitor," he admitted hesitantly. "Someone I did not recognize at first. Older, quiet. I only saw them briefly in the hallway near the study. I thought it was a delivery, or perhaps someone conducting repairs." Delacroix raised an eyebrow. "Did you confront them?" Henri shook his head. "No, I was told not to. That they were authorized, I suppose. They seemed serious, insistent. I did not want to anger them." The detective noted the subtle tension in Henry's posture, the slight tremor of his hands, the avoidance of direct eye contact. It was a minor crack, but significant. Someone had leveraged Henry's obedience and youth, using him as a barrier rather than an accomplice, to remove evidence without leaving overt traces. Next, Delacroix turned his attention to Madame Lefebvre. "Have you noticed anything unusual in the household recently?" he asked. Her posture was calm, hands folded neatly, but her eyes betrayed alertness, a flicker of something withheld. She hesitated before speaking. "I have seen shadows moving where they should not. The doors of the study sometimes left ajar when no one entered. Papers shifted, or appeared to shift. I assumed it was my imagination, or perhaps wind through the windows. But now, Inspector, perhaps it was not mere happenstance." Delacroix's mind traced the implications, the subtle movement of shadows, the deliberate erasure of evidence, the calculated manipulation of a young witness. Someone was orchestrating events not merely to conceal guilt, but to actively mislead, to control the flow of information and forestall discovery. He returned to the study, this time with a magnifying glass and a careful eye for minutiae. There were traces of a smudged fingerprint near the lock of the desk, nearly invisible but suggesting a hurried touch. Slight scratches along the edge of the floorboards indicated that a small, delicate object, perhaps the envelope or a thin stack of papers, had been slid forcibly from its hiding place. The work was deliberate, professional, and precise. Whoever had done this was skilled, patient, and intimately familiar with the household's routines. The implications weighed heavily on Delacroix. The stakes had risen sharply. The crime was no longer simply a matter of disappearance and misdirection. Someone was actively interfering with the investigation, targeting specific evidence, and seeking to bury the truth before it could be revealed. The sense of urgency became palpable. Every subsequent interview, every movement within the house had to be measured carefully. Trust had become fragile and alliances uncertain. That evening, he gathered the household once more. Madame Rousseau remained composed, her eyes steady but alert. Henri fidgeted, glancing nervously between the inspector and the closed study door. Madame Lefebvre's hands were folded tightly, the faintest crease in her brow suggesting vigilance rather than fear. "I have noticed," Delacroix began, "that evidence sometimes disappears not by chance but by design. Someone has attempted to remove a letter and associated documents from the study, leaving only traces behind. The subtlety of the act, the precision. It is not the work of a casual hand, nor of someone acting impulsively. This is deliberate. He allowed a moment of silence to settle over the room, letting the weight of the words sink in. The effect was immediate. Henri's posture stiffened, a slight flush rising to his cheeks. Madame Lefebvre's eyes flickered toward the study, sharp and calculating. Madame Rousseau's fingers tightened around her music box, almost imperceptibly. Delacroix continued, choosing his words with care. It is clear that someone among us, or at least someone with access to the household, has sought to manipulate the investigation, to control what can be seen and what cannot. We must consider carefully who has the knowledge, the opportunity, and the skill to conduct such a removal. Henri swallowed audibly, then spoke before he could hesitate further. Inspector, I saw someone remove papers yesterday evening. I did not think it important at the time. I thought it might have been Madame Lefebvre, but it was someone else, someone I do not know. Delacroix's mind raced, connecting threads with urgency. A new actor had emerged, someone deliberately shadowing the household, orchestrating removals and misdirection. The subtlety of their actions suggested a practiced hand, perhaps the same influence that had guided Henri to place the envelope in the first place. The crime, he realized, was layered more deeply than ever, combining immediate manipulation with long-standing hidden orchestration. He turned finally to Madame Lefebvre. Do you recognize the signs of this intervention, or have you observed anything that might identify who is responsible? Her response was measured but telling. I have noticed movements and sounds. Footsteps at odd hours, doors left open when they should be closed, papers shifted, items slightly out of place. Whoever it is, they move with knowledge, not recklessness. I cannot identify them, but I am certain they exist, and they are aware of the investigation. The revelation underscored the fragile state of trust within the house. Each member, willing or unwilling participant, had become part of a delicate balance of knowledge, suspicion, and potential deception. The theft of the crucial evidence had altered the landscape entirely. Any assumptions of certainty were now suspect, any previously established narrative subject to sudden collapse. Delacroix made a silent note of the strategic implications. The investigation would now require vigilance not only in gathering evidence, but in protecting it. Any further misstep could erase key traces forever. The criminal's confidence, his awareness of the detective's methods, suggested that the next move would be decisive. Whoever manipulated Henri, removed the documents, and shadowed the household had carefully studied the investigation, anticipating responses and preparing countermeasures. As night fell over Paris, the Rousseau house seemed to hold its breath. Delacroix stood alone in the drawing-room, the ballerina music box spinning silently on the mantel. The stolen evidence, the subtle fingerprints, the smudges and scratches, they all spoke of a vigilant adversary, someone who would not act recklessly, yet whose patience was matched only by their cunning. The detective understood that the next phase of the investigation would require both ingenuity and restraint. The truth remained concealed, and someone in the shadows was determined to keep it that way. Trust, he realized, had become a fragile commodity. Every action, every observation, every question had to be carefully weighed. The vanishing evidence was not merely a setback, it was a statement. Someone knew he was close. Someone knew the threads of the past, the manipulations of the present, and was actively seeking to bury the truth before it could be fully revealed. The stakes had risen. The game, Delacroix understood, had entered a perilous new stage. The following morning, Paris awoke beneath a slate-grey sky, the mist lingering low over the streets like a shroud. Inside the Rousseau house, Delacroix sensed the tension had shifted from caution to urgency. The vanishing of the envelope and accompanying documents had unsettled the household, and though he had taken steps to secure the remaining evidence, the city outside seemed to pulse with an unspoken threat. It was an instinctive awareness. Something was moving beyond the household, unseen but deliberate, and it would not remain content with concealment alone. Delacroix began his rounds in the quiet rooms, examining each surface, each object, as though anticipating another act of interference. The study door, carefully locked and inspected the night before, bore faint scratches that had not been present previously. Someone had attempted entry, but their method was crude compared to the previous removal of evidence. Whoever it was, the perpetrator was becoming bolder, testing both the household and the detective. A sudden commotion from the street below drew his attention. Henri, pale and breathless, rushed into the room. "Inspector, it's Madame Fournier," he stammered. "Something's happened. She's gone." Delacroix followed swiftly to the window, peering down at the narrow cobbled street. Madame Fournier's shop stood shuttered, its door ajar. The usual display of delicate linens and porcelain had been disturbed, drawers open, items scattered as though in haste. Yet no one was present. The door to the shop creaked faintly in the wind, moving slightly on its hinges, and Delacroix noted the prints in the dust outside, footprints leading away in a hurried, uneven pattern. The detective's heart tightened. This was no ordinary disappearance. Someone had taken Madame Fournier, either as a warning, a diversion, or a deliberate act to escalate the situation. The threads of the investigation were no longer confined to the Rousseau household. The network of manipulation now extended into the wider streets of Paris, touching lives and endangering those involved. Delacroix's first instinct was to secure the immediate perimeter. He instructed Henri to remain at the house and alert the authorities, while he moved swiftly toward the shop. The closer he drew, the more evidence of disturbance became apparent. Drawers had been rifled through, a cash box overturned, papers torn or missing, and a faint smear of something dark, perhaps ink, perhaps blood, streaked across the counter. The signs indicated a struggle, a purposeful act designed to leave Madame Fournier disoriented or incapacitated. Inside the shop, a small piece of evidence caught his eye, a scrap of paper torn from a larger document bearing a familiar emblem, one identical to the watermark on the recovered envelope. Delacroix's pulse quickened. The connection was unmistakable. The same hand orchestrating the Rousseau household manipulations was directly responsible for this latest act. This was no longer a matter of concealment. The villain was escalating, forcing the investigation into dangerous territory. Delacroix knelt, examining the torn scrap carefully. The faint trace of handwriting suggested instructions or a message deliberately left for discovery. Whoever had done this was taunting him, demonstrating both reach and audacity. The villain's strategy was clear: destabilize the detective, scatter attention across multiple sites, and maintain control of the narrative. He turned his attention to the street, scanning for signs of flight. The footprints, shallow and erratic, suggested a person moving quickly but with care to avoid leaving obvious clues. Delacroix noted the direction toward a narrow alleyway behind the shop, a route that would allow escape from casual observation but still afford the captor close proximity to the Rousseau household if needed. His mind worked rapidly, considering possible motives and strategies. Madame Fournier had been peripheral in the investigation, offering observations but no direct involvement. Her disappearance, therefore, was likely designed to provoke fear, mislead, and perhaps draw attention away from the more critical threads of the original case. It was a clever tactic, forcing Delacroix to divide his focus, and it revealed the villain's intimate understanding of his methods. Delacroix began to trace the alleyway, moving silently, observing shadows and listening for sounds that might indicate a struggle or presence. He noticed subtle traces of fabric caught on the rough stone of a wall, the faint smell of ink lingering in the air, evidence that corroborated his theory of the villain's handiwork. Every small detail seemed deliberately placed, leaving a trail, only detectable to one trained to observe and interpret such nuances. Halfway down the alley he glimpsed movement, a figure darting into a narrow courtyard beyond. Delacroix pursued, careful not to alert the person to his presence, but upon arrival he found the courtyard empty. Only a single item remained, a small, delicately carved wooden box, its lid ajar. Inside was a miniature music box, similar to those in the Rousseau household, and a note written in the same precise hand: "Closer than you think, the game is not yet complete." Delacroix's jaw tightened. The villain had anticipated that he would follow every clue, each minor trace, and this act of provocation was meant to signal dominance, control, and superiority. The threat was direct and personal. The message confirmed that Madame Fournier's disappearance was a calculated maneuver, not an accident, designed to unsettle and manipulate. Returning to the Rousseau household, Delacroix felt the weight of urgency pressing on him. The second crime had demonstrated conclusively that the villain remained several steps ahead, capable of anticipating moves, orchestrating diversions, and instilling fear. Every member of the household was now potentially in danger, and the detective recognized that containment and strategy were paramount. He convened the household in the drawing room once more. Madame Rousseau's composure was strained, but she met his gaze with a quiet steadiness. Henri, pale and restless, fidgeted in the corner, acutely aware that his earlier missteps had left him vulnerable. Madame Lefebvre's calm exterior remained, yet her eyes betrayed tension and vigilance. Delacroix spoke deliberately, keeping his tone measured to prevent panic. "Madame Fournier has been taken," he began. "This is no random act. It is deliberate, designed to challenge the investigation, to misdirect, and to assert control. Whoever orchestrates these events is skilled, patient, and observing us closely. We must assume that further acts could occur and plan accordingly." He paused, allowing the gravity of his words to settle. "We are no longer dealing with a crime confined to a single household. The perpetrator's reach extends beyond these walls. Your cooperation, your attentiveness, and your trust in one another are now more critical than ever." Henri's voice trembled. "Inspector, will she be harmed?" Delacroix's eyes met the young man's. "Perhaps, but our priority is to prevent further harm. Every action we take must be measured. Patience and observation will be our tools." As night descended over the city, Delacroix moved to secure the household and establish a perimeter. He considered all possibilities: the villain's capacity for foresight, the deliberate disruption of evidence, and the escalating nature of the attacks. Each move now carried weight, each choice the potential to prevent or provoke another tragedy. The second crime had shifted the landscape dramatically. It was no longer a matter of reconstructing the past or interpreting subtle clues. It was a matter of anticipation, strategy, and protection. The villain was not merely hiding behind layers of deception. He was actively shaping events, creating a tension-filled game in which the detective, witnesses, and potential victims were all pieces on a meticulously designed board. Delacroix remained in the drawing room, examining the miniature music box and the note, the cold weight of realization settling over him. The investigation had entered a dangerous new phase, one in which he must not only uncover the perpetrator, but prevent further acts, anticipate the unseen hand-guiding events, and outmaneuver a mind several steps ahead. The city outside slept, oblivious to the machinations unfolding within its narrow streets and quiet courtyards. Inside the Rousseau house, the tension was palpable. Delacroix understood that every decision, every observation, and every subtle maneuver would now determine whether the next act would be merely a revelation or a tragedy waiting to unfold. The game had sharpened, the stakes had risen, and the villain remained hidden, always a step ahead, always watching, always waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. Delacroix returned to the Rousseau house at dawn, the mist still clinging to the streets like a stubborn memory. The second crime, the disappearance of Madame Fournier, had unsettled him, but it had also sharpened his focus. Each act of interference, each subtle provocation, now seemed less like random chaos and more like calculated moves in a deliberate sequence. The more he reviewed the events, the more he sensed a hidden structure beneath the surface, a pattern waiting to reveal itself. He began in the drawing room, observing the arrangement of the music boxes once more. Each one, meticulously curated and displayed, had a presence beyond mere ornamentation. As he carefully traced the positions, the dates of acquisition, and the intricate carvings, a faint memory nudged at the edge of his consciousness, a remark Henri had made weeks before, almost in passing, about the way Madame Rousseau preferred the boxes arranged. Not chronologically, but according to their smallest distinguishing features. "She says the boxes are like people," Henri had said, his voice unguarded. "Each one has its own manner, its own story. You can't just line them up by date, they need to sit where they belong." At the time, Delacroix had filed the comment away as an eccentricity, a quaint glimpse into Madame Rousseau's peculiar habits. But now, in the aftermath of manipulated evidence, disappearances, and taunting messages, the remark assumed new weight. Perhaps the arrangement of the music boxes was more than decorative. Perhaps it was an encoded map of intentions, relationships, or even culpabilities. He began to study each piece carefully, noting subtle markings, tiny scratches, and the faint smudges of polish. One box, a delicate ballerina on a mirrored stage, bore the faintest hint of red dust on its base. Another, a wind-up bird, had an almost imperceptible scratch along its underside, aligning with the previous box in a precise, deliberate angle. The arrangement was not random, it was signalling something. Delacroix retraced his steps through the household, noting the placement of minor objects, the habits of each member, and the sequence of events as they had unfolded. Every movement, every action, even those initially dismissed as irrelevant, began to coalesce into a coherent framework. Henri's repeated glances at the study door, Madame Lefebvre's careful but vigilant positioning during conversations, and Madame Rousseau's calm, almost imperceptible adjustments of the music boxes. All these details aligned with a deliberate choreography that had been playing out unnoticed. It was a small, seemingly insignificant detail that ultimately cracked the case open. During a moment of quiet observation, Delacroix noticed a single envelope tucked behind one of the larger music boxes. Its presence had escaped notice amid the chaos of missing evidence, misplaced papers, and deliberate diversions. Unlike the previously recovered envelope, this one bore no attempt at concealment. It simply rested in its place, almost inviting discovery. Delacroix examined it carefully. The handwriting was familiar, elegant, deliberate, the same precise hand that had orchestrated the prior manipulations. But unlike the earlier missives, this one contained nothing overtly misleading. Instead, it was an index of minor details, dates, names, times, and objects, each seemingly trivial, yet collectively pointing to specific interactions between the household and outside influences. The document mapped the patterns of intrusion, the sequence of misdirection, and, crucially, the timing of each act. As he read, a realization struck him. The villain had not only manipulated events, but had also left a breadcrumb trail, a pattern, deliberately or unconsciously encoded in the familiar habits of the household. The minor eccentricities, the overlooked remarks, the habitual adjustments of objects, all had formed a lattice of cues. The key had not been in the missing evidence, nor the vanished witness, nor the overt acts of deception. It had been in plain sight, integrated seamlessly into the rhythms of everyday life. Delacroix recalled Henri's description of the earlier envelope placement. "I only followed instructions," Henri had said, but now it became clear that the instructions had been layered into ordinary routines. The young man had moved objects and placed envelopes not at random, but according to a pre-existing structure, one subtly dictated by the habits and interactions of the household. Every act, however minor, had reinforced the pattern. The detective's mind raced, piecing together connections he had once considered peripheral. The stolen documents, the missing papers, the taunting note left in the alley, all of these had followed a trajectory dictated by the same hidden logic. Each incident, when viewed in isolation, had seemed chaotic, unpredictable, or provocatively random. But, in aggregate, they formed a sequence, a roadmap of intent and influence, pointing toward the orchestrator's identity and methods. He returned to the study to re-examine the layout of the remaining documents, now arranged in a deliberate, methodical order. Dates and inscriptions on the music boxes aligned with events. The purchase of a specific box coinciding with a prior intrusion. The movement of a drawer paralleling Henri's guided placement of an envelope. And even the subtle adjustments of the housekeeper, reflecting awareness of the manipulations. The pattern was almost mathematical in precision, a network of cause and effect, carefully woven into the fabric of the household. As Delacroix followed the connections, the pieces of the past resurfaced with new clarity. The forgotten case involving Henri's father, the minor grievances of the Rousseau household, the subtle instructions given to Henri, all of these were part of a continuum. The villain's strategy had relied on long-standing patterns of influence, habitual behaviors, and the predictable rhythms of daily life. It was not brute force or opportunity that had facilitated the crimes, but a meticulous exploitation of routine, expectation, and human psychology. He paused, reflecting on the significance of the discovery. The key had always been in plain sight, obscured only by the apparent randomness of minor details. The villain's genius lay in the ability to hide in the familiar, to manipulate without leaving overt traces, and to anticipate the responses of those observing from the outside. Delacroix understood that solving the case would require not only careful reconstruction of events, but also an acute sensitivity to the ordinary, the habitual, and the seemingly trivial. Returning to the drawing room, he shared his observations with the household. "The key," he explained, "has not been hidden in missing objects, stolen documents, or overt acts of deception. It has been here all along, embedded in the routines, the habits, and the minor details of daily life. Every movement, every adjustment, every seemingly insignificant remark has contributed to a pattern. It is in these ordinary actions that the extraordinary has been concealed." Madame Rousseau, for the first time, allowed a faint smile to touch her lips. "So it was all in how we lived, in what we did without realizing it?" Delacroix nodded. "Precisely. The villain relied on predictability, on the unnoticed rhythm of life, to orchestrate events from behind the scenes. And now that the pattern is revealed, we can anticipate the next moves, understand the motives, and identify the orchestrator." Henri exhaled, relief and fear mingling on his face. I did not see it before. I only thought I was following orders." "You were," Delacroix said gently. "But the orders themselves were part of a broader sequence, one that has now become visible. We can use this understanding to protect those at risk and to prevent further misdirection." Delacroix spent the remainder of the day mapping the pattern meticulously, linking each act to the corresponding habitual behaviors, noting where prior observations had been misinterpreted or overlooked. The seemingly chaotic series of events now revealed a coherent trajectory, a chain of influence, manipulation, and orchestration designed to conceal the villain's identity while controlling the investigation. By nightfall, the detective could see the emerging picture in its entirety. The pattern was not just a roadmap of past actions, but a predictive tool for the future, a guide to anticipate the villain's next move. The seemingly insignificant details, the minor scratches on a music box, the fleeting glance at a study door, the offhand comment about placement, had been the key all along. What had seemed trivial was, in fact, the foundation upon which the entire mystery had been built. Outside, Paris was quiet beneath a misted sky, the streets echoing faintly with distant footsteps. Inside the Rousseau house, Delacroix felt a renewed clarity. The villain, who had seemed several steps ahead, had inadvertently revealed the structure of their operations. The chaos of the previous days now yielded to an emerging order, one that illuminated both motive and method. The detective understood, with a mixture of satisfaction and trepidation, that the revelation of the pattern had brought him closer than ever to uncovering the orchestrator. The game was far from over, but the rules had been exposed, and in that exposure, Delacroix knew, lay the power to end the hidden manipulations, prevent further harm, and finally bring the shadows into the light. Delacroix spent the following morning immersed in the household, examining the minutiae that had now become the foundation of his understanding. The pattern, once invisible, had crystallized into a map of subtle manipulations, habitual movements, and carefully placed clues. Yet understanding the how of the crimes was only half of the battle. To bring the orchestrator into the light, he had to uncover the why, the hidden motive that had driven such meticulous orchestration, such cold calculation, and ultimately, such cruelty. He began by revisiting Madame Rousseau. The widow remained calm, composed, and observant as ever, though Delacroix could sense the tension beneath her elegant exterior. He questioned her gently, seeking insight not into facts, but into the emotional currents of the household and the relationships within it. "Madame Rousseau," he said, "you have lived here for many years. You understand the rhythms of this household, the habits of its members. Tell me, has there ever been a source of friction, resentment, or obsession that might explain the length someone would go to manipulate events so thoroughly?" She paused, a faint sigh escaping her lips. Inspector, you must understand. In a household as old and established as this one, everyone carries their histories, old grievances, unspoken rivalries. Sometimes they fester quietly, unnoticed by those outside, or even by those who live here. But some obsessions, some desires, they can twist reason completely. Her eyes, dark and reflective, lingered on the collection of music boxes. It is never the simple motives, you see. Money, inheritance, trivial jealousy. These are the surface. The deeper currents run far below. Delacroix listened carefully. Her words, while cryptic, suggested an emotional and psychological depth to the crime that he had yet to fully comprehend. He reviewed the sequence of manipulations, the stolen documents, and the vanished witnesses. Each act, meticulously orchestrated, suggested someone not merely motivated by material gain or revenge, but by an obsession of the mind, a compulsion that demanded control, mastery, and dominance over every element of the household and investigation. He returned to Henri, hoping the young man might reveal overlooked threads. Henri's demeanour was anxious, guilt-laden, but under Delacroix's calm questioning, fragments of insight emerged. I think it started before me, Henri confessed. The instructions, the careful placements, they were not just about misleading investigators. They seemed to satisfy something, a sense of control, maybe. Not for money, not for revenge, at least not exactly. I don't know. It felt personal, intimate, like it had to do with understanding the household, understanding people. Delacroix nodded slowly. It was exactly the insight he had been seeking. The villain's motive was rooted not in conventional ambitions, but in a psychological need, an obsessive compulsion to manipulate, observe, and control every element of a situation. Each misdirection, disappearance, and stolen piece of evidence was a calculated move designed to satisfy this deep-seated drive, to orchestrate a scenario in which the orchestrator could assert dominance over both the household and those who investigated it. The breakthrough came when he revisited a minor, previously overlooked detail: Madame Lefebvre's meticulous habits. The housekeeper's eyes had always betrayed careful attention, her movements measured and deliberate. Delacroix recalled a small comment she had made weeks prior. "Some things are only visible if you know where to look, Inspector. Otherwise, the patterns remain hidden." At the time, he had taken it as a remark on her own observational skill. Now, in hindsight, it was more. It indicated awareness, perhaps complicity, or at least intimate knowledge, of the orchestrator's psychological patterns. He began to piece together the connections. Madame Lefebvre, as the household's longtime observer and confidant, would have had access to personal histories, habits, and secrets. She would understand subtle behaviours, patterns, and predictable responses of both Henri and Madame Rousseau. And crucially, she possessed the ability to guide events from the shadows, to provide instruction without ever overtly participating. Delacroix considered the implications. The orchestrator was someone who derived satisfaction not merely from outcomes, but from control itself. The crime was not opportunistic, nor impulsive. It was a deliberate and sustained exercise of power over the environment, over others' perceptions, and over the investigation. The thefts, manipulations, and disappearances were manifestations of this psychological compulsion. The final piece fell into place when he re-examined the recovered notes, the pattern of placements, and the sequences of interaction. One detail, small and easily overlooked, revealed the ultimate motive. The orchestrator's obsession with order and observation extended beyond mere misdirection. They sought to prove their understanding of human behavior, to demonstrate mastery over chaos, and to construct a scenario in which every individual's choices, actions, and reactions could be predicted and controlled. It was a test, a game, but a game played at the cost of others' safety and peace of mind. Delacroix confronted Madame Lefebvre with care. The housekeeper's composure remained steady, though her hands betrayed a subtle tension. "Madame Lefebvre," he began softly, "it seems the crimes were motivated not by inheritance, not by revenge, but by something far more personal, a desire to manipulate, to orchestrate, to assert control over those involved. Everything, the placements, the disappearances, the diversions, points to a psychological compulsion rather than conventional ambition. Would you care to explain your role? Her eyes met his, sharp and unflinching. Inspector, you have seen the pattern. You understand its logic. Perhaps it is true that I guided certain actions subtly, but my intent was never harm. I only sought understanding, to see if the pieces of the household, the observers, the young Henri, if we could be predicted, anticipated, and, perhaps, corrected if necessary. Delacroix's heart sank slightly. The revelation was staggering. The orchestrator's motives were rooted in an obsessive, almost clinical desire to dominate and understand, not through violence for gain, but through manipulation for mastery. The cruelty and risk were byproducts, consequences of a mind consumed by compulsion and a need to orchestrate human behavior as though it were an experiment. The implications rippled through the household. Henri's face was pale, guilt and relief mingling in his expression. Madame Rousseau remained poised, though the faintest shadow of unease crossed her features. The detective understood. That exposure of the motive would not necessarily absolve her fear or Henri's complicity. They had been instruments, unwittingly, in an exercise of psychological mastery. Delacroix returned to the study, examining the final documents and placements with a careful eye. The sequence of manipulations, the careful orchestration, the incremental escalations, all pointed back to a single psychological imperative: to create a controlled system, to observe and influence human reactions, and to assert dominance over both events and those who attempted to understand them. It was the mind of a strategist, an obsessive planner, and a manipulator, entirely consumed by the need to prove that nothing was random, that every action could be predicted, and every outcome controlled. For the first time, the detective understood the full depth of the villain's psychology. This was not a crime of passion, envy, or material desire. It was an exercise in compulsion, mastery, and intellectual domination. The orchestrator had placed themselves above conventional morality, above consequence, seeking not wealth, not revenge, but the pure satisfaction of control and insight. As night fell over the Rousseau house, Delacroix considered the path forward. Understanding the motive did not end the threat, it clarified it. The villain remained capable, aware, and driven by a compulsion that would not cease simply because the crime was exposed. Every move from this point onward required careful anticipation, precise planning, and the steady application of both observation and strategy. The hidden motive, now revealed, cast a long shadow over the household. The crimes had been committed not for gain, not for revenge, not even for simple mischief. They had been executed for the quiet, terrifying satisfaction of a mind that sought mastery over circumstance, over others, and over the course of events itself. Delacroix knew that this understanding would be the key to bringing the orchestrator into the light, to preventing further harm, and to ultimately resolving a case that had begun as a baffling disappearance but had evolved into an extraordinary study of human obsession, cunning, and control. And so, with the motive now unveiled, the detective prepared to confront the mind behind the manipulations, aware that the true danger lay not only in what had already been done, but in what the villain might still attempt, driven by a compulsion that would not be easily restrained. Delacroix had spent the day preparing for the culmination of the investigation, the threads of manipulation and obsession finally forming a complete tapestry. The pattern of events, the hidden motive, the stolen documents, and the vanished witnesses, all were now accounted for in his mind, each a stepping stone toward exposing the orchestrator. He understood the villain's psychology as fully as the circumstances allowed: a compulsion for control, a meticulous manipulation of human behavior, and an obsession with testing the predictability of others. With this knowledge, he knew that the final confrontation had to be as precise, controlled, and calculated as the crimes themselves. He arranged the household in the drawing-room under the guise of routine observation. Madame Rousseau sat gracefully, her expression calm, yet her hands betrayed a faint tremor as she adjusted a music box on the mantel. Henri lingered near the doorway, anxious but attentive, aware that the endgame was at hand. Madame Lefebvre, as composed as ever, observed with the cool detachment of someone accustomed to control, but Delacroix could see the subtle tension in her posture, the faint tightening of her jaw. The trap, though subtle, was perfectly aligned with the orchestrator's methods. Delacroix had ensured that every item of interest, the remaining envelopes, the recovered documents, and a selection of music boxes, was placed where it would naturally draw the villain's attention. He had also arranged for a trusted officer to remain discreetly stationed nearby, invisible to all but himself. The stage was set, not with force, but with the expectation that the orchestrator's own compulsion would lead them into action. He spoke calmly, deliberately, allowing his words to carry weight without raising alarm. "We have come far in understanding the events that have unsettled this household. We have traced every action, every movement, every misdirection. The patterns are clear, and the motivations are no longer hidden. The time has come to address the source of these manipulations directly." There was a long pause, heavy with tension, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Then, with a fluid motion almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, Madame Lefebvre shifted slightly, her gaze flicking toward the arrangement of music boxes on the mantel. It was a subtle act, but for Delacroix it was the confirmation he had anticipated. The compulsion, the need to intervene, to correct, to manipulate, was too strong for her to resist. "Do you see, Inspector?" she asked, her voice measured, calm but tinged with a challenge. "The patterns, the arrangements, they are all before us. You believe that observing them makes you superior, that you can predict what is to come. But patterns are living things. They adapt, they shift, they resist containment." Delacroix nodded slowly, maintaining his composure. "And yet, every movement you have made, every adjustment, every attempt at misdirection, has been noted. The patterns are clear not only in the objects, but in the choices, the reactions, and the obsessions that guided them. We understand the compulsion that drove you to these actions, and we understand the consequences it has wrought." Her eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of defiance breaking through the composed mask. "Consequences? You speak as though this were a crime committed for gain or revenge. You see only what is surface. But it is the study of behavior, the orchestration of circumstance. That is the work of genius. You cannot simply confine it within the bounds of morality." Delacroix's voice remained steady, even as he moved closer, each step measured, purposeful. "Genius, perhaps, but obsession without restraint is dangerous. The harm done cannot be overlooked. The vanished documents, the interference with evidence, the endangerment of Madame Fournier, they are not abstract results. They are concrete, real, and undeniable. Your games have consequences, and now they end." For a brief moment, the orchestrator's composure faltered. Her gaze darted toward the collection of objects, then toward Henri, then back at Delacroix. She weighed options, calculating risk and opportunity in a flurry of thought, revealing the mind that had guided such precise manipulations for weeks. Then, almost imperceptibly, she reached for a small envelope tucked behind a music box, the very one Delacroix had deliberately left accessible. It was a final test, a last move, perhaps to mislead, to destroy, or to conceal one last piece of evidence. Delacroix moved with subtle speed, positioning himself between her and the envelope. "Stop," he said quietly, but firmly. "That action will only confirm everything we already know." Her eyes widened slightly, not in fear, but in the recognition of inevitability. She realized that the trap had been perfectly aligned with her compulsion, that her own need to orchestrate and manipulate had led her directly into Delacroix's control. The veneer of calm cracked ever so slightly, revealing the human underpinnings of a mind otherwise consumed by obsession. I see," she said finally, her voice quieter now, edged with the faintest trace of resignation. "You understood the pattern, every step, every minor adjustment, every influence. How did you—" Her words faltered, leaving only the acknowledgement of the inevitable. Delacroix's gaze remained unwavering. The pattern was always there, hidden in plain sight. The minor details, the habits, the overlooked adjustments, they were all part of the design. and understanding those details is what allowed us to anticipate your actions and prevent further harm. It is over, Madame Lefebvre. There is nowhere left to move without exposure." A silence fell over the room, thick with tension and relief alike. Henri's shoulders relaxed, the unspoken fear that had clung to him for days finally giving way to cautious hope. Madame Rousseau remained poised, though her eyes betrayed a mixture of astonishment and apprehension. The orchestrator looked at the objects around her, at the music boxes, the carefully positioned envelopes, the traces of her own compulsions now laid bare, and finally she lowered her gaze. "So it ends," she whispered, a quiet acknowledgement of the truth she had sought to control and manipulate. Delacroix signalled subtly to the officer stationed nearby. With precise timing, the villain was guided gently but firmly from the room, the calm exterior masking the internal storm of a mind confronted with the inevitable consequences of obsession. The final confrontation had been executed not through force or intimidation, but through understanding, anticipation, and the careful alignment of evidence, behavior, and psychological insight. As the door closed behind Madame Lefebvre, the household exhaled collectively, the tension of weeks finally giving way to a fragile sense of relief. Delacroix allowed himself a moment to observe, to absorb the aftermath. The patterns were resolved, the manipulations exposed, and the true motive, the obsession that had driven the orchestrator to extremes, was now fully understood. He walked slowly through the drawing room, noting each music box, each envelope, each subtle trace of the orchestrator's compulsive influence. Every piece of evidence, every small detail, had led to this moment. The case, which had begun as a baffling disappearance, had evolved into a meticulous study of human behavior, compulsion, and the extraordinary lengths to which obsession could drive an individual. Outside, the Parisian streets were quiet once more, the mist lifting as dawn crept across the city. Inside the Rousseau house, life could begin to resume its ordinary rhythm, though the lessons of the investigation, the subtle power of patterns, the fragility of trust, and the depth of human obsession would linger. Delacroix knew that, for all its resolution, the memory of these events would remain, a testament to the delicate interplay of psychology, observation, and methodical deduction that had brought the orchestrator to justice. For the detective, the satisfaction lay not only in the capture, but in the knowledge that the trap had worked because it mirrored the mind of the villain, anticipating the compulsions that had guided every act. The final confrontation had not been a battle of force, but a victory of understanding, the ultimate triumph of insight over manipulation and reason over obsession. The Rousseau household, once a theatre of uncertainty, now stood quiet, the echoes of chaos replaced by the fragile calm of resolution. Delacroix knew the lessons of the case would remain with him, a reminder that the most intricate crimes often hide in the ordinary, and that the sharpest tools in solving them are patience, observation, and the careful study of human nature itself. Delacroix allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction in the calm of the Rousseau household. Madame Lefebvre had been taken into custody, the manipulated evidence accounted for, and the vanishing of Madame Fournier now explained through the web of orchestrated misdirection. Henri had begun to relax, and even Madame Rousseau allowed herself a quiet exhale, the weight of fear lifting from her poised shoulders. It seemed finally that the case was resolved. Yet, for a detective of Delacroix's experience, such calm was rarely the end. His instincts, honed over decades of observation, whispered a caution. The surface resolution often concealed subtler currents, waiting to reveal themselves at the last possible moment. He returned to the drawing room one last time, surveying the room with deliberate care. The music boxes, now neatly arranged as they had been prior to the chaos, gleamed softly in the morning light. The envelopes, their contents scrutinized, had been accounted for. Every corner of the house had been examined, every potential hiding place considered. And yet, as Delacroix's eyes swept over the familiar details, a small anomaly caught his attention, a piece so slight it might have been overlooked even by the most attentive observer. A miniature figurine, part of the music box collection, had been slightly misaligned. Its base, carved delicately to match the others, bore a barely perceptible scratch, angled in a manner inconsistent with any previous adjustments. It was subtle, almost meaningless, but the detective's experience told him otherwise. Such a mark was not accidental. Someone had returned, or perhaps had never left, and had left a deliberate signal for those trained to notice. He bent closer, examining the scratch under the soft light. Beneath it was a faint trace of pencil writing, invisible to the casual eye. Delacroix's heart quickened as he read the nearly erased inscription, a date, a time, and a set of initials that did not match any member of the household. The implication was immediate. The orchestrator they had apprehended might not have been acting alone, or might not have been the true mastermind at all. Delacroix's mind raced, piecing together inconsistencies that had seemed inconsequential until now. Madame Lefebvre's compulsion, the carefully guided placements, the subtleties of instruction, perhaps all of it had been a carefully staged diversion. Someone else, someone patient, methodical and cunning, had remained hidden in the shadows, pulling strings while the household and Delacroix focused on the apparent villain. He returned to the recovered documents, comparing handwriting, paper types and subtle idiosyncrasies. One overlooked pattern leapt out at him. Small annotations in the margins, a series of faint marks that seemed innocuous at first glance, now revealed a second layer of orchestration. The handwriting, though familiar in form, was distinct from Madame Lefebvre's precise style. The subtle differences, the curve of letters, the pressure of the pencil, the spacing between words, pointed toward a second mind, one that had anticipated not only the household's movements, but also the investigative responses of Delacroix himself. Delacroix gathered Henri and Madame Rousseau, careful not to alarm them unnecessarily. "There is something we have overlooked," he said. "The orchestration you witnessed, the manipulations, even the apparent confessions, they may not reflect the entirety of the scheme. We must consider the possibility that someone else has remained unseen, influencing events from a position of secrecy." Henri's face paled. "You mean someone was controlling her too?" "Precisely," Delacroix replied. "All the actions we attributed to compulsion and personal obsession may have been influenced, even directed, by another hand. The game is far from over, and the true mastermind may still be observing, testing, and anticipating our responses." The detective returned to the study, reviewing his notes with meticulous care. The faint pencil markings, the residual dust on the figurine, and the anomalies in the envelopes, all pointed to a singular conclusion. The orchestrator they had apprehended had been an instrument, a participant guided by a more cunning mind. Someone with intimate knowledge of the household and the investigative methods employed by Delacroix had orchestrated a scenario within a scenario, a labyrinthine plan designed to mislead and manipulate multiple parties simultaneously. Delacroix realized that this hidden mastermind must possess three qualities: patience beyond normal comprehension, acute observational skill, and a profound understanding of human psychology. They had orchestrated events so that the most obvious culprit, the compulsive housekeeper, would draw attention, occupy investigative resources, and act in a predictable manner. Meanwhile, the real manipulator had remained in the background, shaping the narrative, influencing decisions, and leaving faint clues only for a trained mind to detect. He turned his attention to Madame Rousseau, the woman at the heart of the household. Her calm, steady composure had never wavered, and yet Delacroix now wondered if she had been entirely forthright. The subtle gestures, the measured comments, the timing of her own movements, small, almost imperceptible signals, now demanded scrutiny under this new hypothesis. Could she, the widow, have been the hidden hand guiding events all along? It seemed improbable, yet the evidence, when re-examined in this light, suggested a mind capable of such orchestration. Delacroix decided to test the theory. He arranged a series of seemingly innocuous objects across the drawing room, each chosen to reflect a small detail of prior manipulations. He left them in a configuration designed to provoke a reaction from someone intimately familiar with the patterns. Then, he and Henri observed quietly from a shadowed corner, maintaining the pretense of routine. It did not take long. Madame Rousseau's gaze lingered on the objects longer than necessary, a subtle tightening of the fingers, a brief hesitation that betrayed recognition. She adjusted a figurine, aligning it with a precision that mirrored previous interventions in the household. Her movements were calm, elegant, and measured, but deliberate. It was, in essence, a fingerprint of the true mastermind, someone orchestrating from within, unseen, yet confident that her subtle influence would go undetected. Delacroix stepped forward. "Madame Rousseau," he said quietly, the tone of observation rather than accusation. "It seems there is more to this than we initially understood. The manipulations, the orchestrations, they bear a mark that is unmistakably yours." Her eyes widened ever so slightly, the faintest flicker of surprise crossing her otherwise composed face. "Inspector," she replied smoothly, I do not understand." "Everything has been explained. The housekeeper, the notes, the diversions. Are they not sufficient?" Delacroix's gaze remained steady. "Sufficient for an observer who does not account for subtleties, but the faint traces, the small corrections, the minor adjustments in the objects, these point to a hand far more deliberate than mere compulsion. The true architect of events has remained hidden in plain sight, guiding the narrative while allowing another to take the blame." For a heartbeat, the room seemed suspended in silence. Then, almost imperceptibly, Madame Rousseau's posture shifted. There was no overt confession, no dramatic reveal, only the subtle acknowledgement in the alignment of her hands, the minute nod of her head, and the fleeting tension in her shoulders. The final twist had arrived. The apparent resolution was an illusion. The true mastermind had been here all along, testing, observing, and orchestrating even the capture of her accomplice. Delacroix allowed a moment for the revelation to settle, knowing the delicate confrontation required calm, patience, and strategy. He had anticipated this possibility, and now the final challenge would be to confront the widow with evidence, to elicit either acknowledgement or error, and to ensure that the case could truly be closed. The room was quiet, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on everyone present. Delacroix's mind raced, arranging each detail, anticipating every possible reaction. The investigation, which had seemed concluded, had revealed its final layer, an unseen hand, the subtle genius of manipulation, and a mind that had remained several steps ahead until now. And as he prepared to confront Madame Rousseau directly, he knew the ultimate test had arrived, not merely of deduction, but of understanding human cunning, the interplay of compulsion, and the extraordinary patience required to reveal a mastermind hidden in plain sight. The case, seemingly resolved, had taken its last and most astonishing turn, and Delacroix's genius would be tested one final time. Delacroix stood in the dim light of the drawing-room, the mist of early evening seeping through the half-open windows. Every object, every subtle mark, every trace of the past week's manipulations lay before him like a carefully drawn map. Madame Rousseau's composure remained flawless, though her eyes betrayed a shadow of tension. The revelation from the previous day, the final, astonishing twist, had unsettled the household, but now the detective was ready to bring matters to their conclusion. Whether justice would be served or the mastermind would slip away, Delacroix intended that every secret, every subtle clue, would finally be exposed. He began by retracing the sequence of events, speaking slowly and deliberately so that all present could follow. The apparent orchestrator, the housekeeper, Madame Lefebvre, acted according to compulsion, influenced by a deep-seated need for control. Her actions created diversions, manipulated evidence, and occupied investigative attention. Yet these behaviors were not entirely her own. They were guided, subtly and deliberately, by someone with a far deeper understanding of human behavior, someone who could anticipate both the household's responses and my own investigative methods. Henri shifted uneasily, glancing at Madame Rousseau, who remained poised but still subtly alert. Delacroix continued, drawing the narrative forward with precision. The overlooked details, the faint scratches on the music boxes, the minor pencil markings on documents, the slight misalignments of figurines, these were not accidents. They were signals, left by the true mastermind, invisible to anyone who did not study the patterns carefully. The traces were in plain sight, embedded in the ordinary rhythms of the household, yet they required both patience and insight to interpret. Madame Rousseau's eyes flickered, betraying the recognition that Delacroix's words were more than theory. They were an accurate reflection of reality. The room was silent, the tension palpable, as Delacroix shifted to the next phase. The true orchestrator, he said, his voice calm yet incisive, relied on predictability. Every movement, every habitual action, every minor eccentricity was observed and integrated into a broader plan. Madame Lefebvre's compulsion to manipulate the objects was exploited, guided along a trajectory calculated to mislead both the household and investigators. And yet, the mastermind's own hand was careful, subtle, and almost invisible, so much so that only an exceptionally trained eye could detect the faintest hints of control. He paused, allowing the weight of his deductions to sink in. Henri swallowed hard, and even Madame Rousseau's fingers flexed imperceptibly, betraying a tension hidden beneath the surface. The traces left, Delacroix continued, were designed to be found, but only by someone able to observe and reason without assumption. They were small, indirect, and consistent, perfectly aligned with the psychological tendencies of those involved. Every misstep, every minor hesitation, every seeming accident, all contributed to the pattern. And now that the pattern is understood, the true orchestrator's identity is revealed. He turned to face Madame Rousseau fully, his gaze steady. It has become evident that you, Madame, were not merely a passive observer, but the hand guiding the events from behind the scenes. Your composure, your timing, and your subtle interventions, all previously unremarkable, align perfectly with the pattern left in plain sight. The traces were there, waiting for someone to read them. And I have. For the first time, the widow's serene mask faltered ever so slightly. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and her hands clenched for an instant before relaxing again. "Inspector, you think me the mastermind?" she asked, her voice smooth yet quivering just enough to betray the tension within. Delacroix inclined his head, acknowledging her reaction without accusation. "The evidence leaves little doubt. Every seemingly minor act, the alignment of objects, the positioning of envelopes, even the timing of your remarks, was deliberate. You guided Madame Lefebvre, exploited predictable behaviors, and orchestrated misdirections that diverted attention from your own hand. The final twist, the seemingly impossible clarity of manipulation, points to you." A silence settled over the room, thick with realization. Henry's eyes widened, a mix of disbelief and fear crossing his features. "But why?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you do all this?" Madame Rousseau met his gaze, her eyes steady now, revealing a mixture of pride, defiance, and something darker. "Because," she said softly, "understanding, control, they are the only forms of power that are absolute. Money, reputation, even affection, they are fleeting, but influence, manipulation, foresight, that is eternal and beyond the reach of ordinary morality. I wanted to prove that the patterns could be observed, predicted, and guided. Everything else, the chaos, the misdirection, the fear, was secondary. It was a test, a study, and a demonstration of skill." Delacroix listened without judgment, noting the chilling clarity of her admission. The truth was more unsettling than any simple motive of greed or revenge. It revealed a mind consumed by calculation, compulsion, and the pursuit of mastery over human behavior. The crimes were not impulsive, they were exercises in dominance and observation, designed to satisfy an obsession that had guided every action. Yet, even as the truth emerged, the question remained, would justice be delivered? Delacroix had anticipated resistance, and indeed Madame Rousseau's next words confirmed the challenge. "Do you believe," she asked, voice calm but eyes sharp, "that the law can confine someone like me? That these threads you have unravelled will trap me completely? You see, the game is never truly over, Inspector. One can predict the past, but the future is still mine to shape." Delacroix's gaze remained unflinching. He had foreseen the possibility of escape, the subtle cunning of a mind like hers. Yet he had prepared for it, anticipating both psychological resistance and practical subterfuge. "The patterns you leave," he said quietly, always carry the signature of your hand. Every trace, however faint, allows prediction, understanding, and intervention. While you may attempt to shape the future, the record of your manipulations is now clear. Others can read it, act upon it, and prevent further harm. You are not beyond consequence. Justice need not rely solely on the law. It relies on insight, observation, and foresight. For a moment, the widow's eyes lingered on him, a mixture of calculation and something akin to admiration. Then, without warning, she turned away, moving with the quiet grace that had defined her presence throughout the ordeal. It was deliberate, smooth, and calculated. Delacroix recognized the motion for what it was, a subtle attempt at escape, a final maneuver in a game that had always been about control. He acted swiftly, signaling the nearby officers, who stepped from the shadows to intercept her. Yet even as they approached, Delacroix allowed a thought to settle. The victory was as much in understanding as in capture. The evidence, the patterns, and the subtle traces of manipulation had been preserved. Whether Madame Rousseau would ultimately face legal consequence or continue to exert her influence elsewhere, the detective's understanding ensured that her methods could be anticipated and countered. The household exhaled collectively, the tension easing, though an undercurrent of unease remained. Henri allowed himself a small, shaky smile, while Madame Lefebvre, released from suspicion, remained quietly contemplative. The room, once a theatre of chaos and manipulation, had returned to a fragile order, though the lessons of the past days, the hidden motives, the subtle manipulations, the obsessive need for control, would linger indefinitely. Delacroix addressed the assembled household one final time. The clues we missed at first, the faint pencil marks, the scratches on the objects, the minor adjustments in the arrangement of familiar items, these were not accidental. They were intentional, subtle, and instructive. They required careful observation and deductive reasoning to interpret. While others saw disorder, we uncovered design. While others were misled by appearances, we discerned truth. He allowed a brief pause, letting the weight of his words sink in. Justice, in this case, is not merely about confinement or punishment. It is about understanding, about revealing patterns that were hidden, about ensuring that the manipulations cannot continue unchecked. The law may take its course, but insight, careful, patient, observant insight, has already ensured that the danger is constrained. Madame Rousseau, now restrained and observing quietly, gave no outward reaction, though Delacroix could sense the calculating mind at work behind her composed exterior. The detective knew that even as the immediate crisis concluded, the presence of a mind so brilliant and so obsessive would always leave a ripple, a reminder that not all threats are visible and not all games can be entirely won. Yet for now, the immediate danger was addressed. The true pattern was revealed, the hidden motive exposed, and the orchestrator, whether contained or temporarily eluding full justice, had left behind a trail so clear that future actions could be anticipated. Delacroix's genius, as ever, had remained one step ahead, unraveling complexity, predicting behavior, and bringing clarity where chaos had reigned. The household settled into uneasy calm, the shadows of manipulation lifted, yet never fully absent. In the quiet aftermath, Delacroix reflected on the extraordinary nature of the case, a study of obsession, of control, and of human cunning. Justice had been served in so far as it could be, but the faint trace of uncertainty lingered, a subtle, unsettling acknowledgement that some games, some minds, never truly end. And as he stepped into the evening streets of Paris, Delacroix knew that while this chapter had concluded, the lessons of observation, insight, and anticipation would endure, tools as vital in the resolution of the present case as they would be in confronting future mysteries yet unseen. Delacroix stepped onto the cobblestone streets outside the Rousseau household, the evening mist curling around the gas lamps like silken threads. The city exhaled a quiet, almost meditative breath after the storm of recent events. Yet for the detective, the resolution of one case never meant complete closure. Every resolved mystery carried echoes of unspoken questions, subtle anomalies, and the faint possibility of overlooked clues. The events of the past days replayed in his mind with a meticulous precision he had cultivated over decades. The disappearance, the stolen documents, the vanishing evidence, and the masterful manipulations of Madame Lefebvre had all been accounted for, or so it seemed. The revelation of Madame Rousseau as the true orchestrator had stunned the household, yet even as the widow had been restrained, Delacroix knew that brilliance, obsession, and cunning could never be entirely confined. There remained a rhythm to her actions, a logic that was only partially visible, a sense that she had left a final mark of her own design, invisible but present. He paused at the corner of the Rue de l'Université, surveying the quiet streets. His eyes, trained to notice even the most insignificant details, fell upon a small scrap of paper caught in the iron grate of a gutter. The edges were worn, the ink faint, yet the faint smudge of handwriting struck him immediately. He retrieved it, careful not to disturb the subtle alignment of the folds, and read the words, "Patterns are never complete. Observe the silence between steps." A chill ran through him. The message, cryptic yet deliberate, carried the unmistakable intelligence of someone intimately aware of the investigation, someone capable of leaving a trace without revealing themselves. The script bore no immediate resemblance to the widow's handwriting, and yet the precision of phrasing suggested a mind trained to influence and manipulate, a mind that was familiar with Delacroix's methods, and perhaps even the patterns of his own thought. He tucked the note into his coat, his mind whirring with possibilities. Had Madame Rousseau anticipated that her influence might be interpreted prematurely, leaving behind a final subtle signal for any detective astute enough to notice it? Or was this the work of an entirely separate hand, an unseen participant who had remained hidden throughout the ordeal, guiding events in parallel without revealing themselves? The uncertainty was tantalizing, almost maddening, yet Delacroix's instincts relished the challenge. As he walked, he replayed the small inconsistencies that had seemed inconsequential in the household. The slight hesitation of Madame Lefebvre when asked about certain objects, the timing of Henry's glances, the faint misalignment of figurines that had initially appeared as accidents. Were these merely the predictable traces of compulsion and manipulation he had already deciphered, or had they been orchestrated by another mind, invisible but deliberate, leaving breadcrumbs only for those perceptive enough to follow? He turned into the quieter lanes near the Seine, the soft splash of water echoing against the stone embankments. The city, calm and serene in appearance, held countless secrets behind closed doors, and Delacroix understood better than anyone that resolution was rarely absolute. Each case, each solved mystery, merely revealed the surface of a deeper, more intricate pattern, a network of human behavior, compulsion, and ambition that extended beyond immediate comprehension. He thought again of Madame Rousseau, poised and enigmatic, aware that her game had been partially exposed, yet perhaps still holding cards unknown to anyone but herself. The thought unsettled him in a familiar, almost thrilling way. The mind that had orchestrated events with such subtlety was not easily confined. Even if she were brought before the law, the faintest traces of influence, the unseen strategies and psychological manipulations could endure, reminders that the most brilliant criminals often leave an imprint of their intellect that persists long after they are captured. Crossing a narrow bridge, he paused to look at his reflection in the rippling water. There was satisfaction in the knowledge that the manipulations had been deciphered, the compulsion understood, and the immediate danger contained. Yet alongside this satisfaction was a persistent curiosity, the sense that a piece of the puzzle remained missing, a whisper of another layer just beyond perception. Delacroix knew that such mysteries, subtle and hidden, were the lifeblood of his work. They ensured that a detective's mind never rested, that observation and deduction remained perpetually sharp. He recalled the faint smudge of ink on the corner of a document recovered from Madame Lefebvre's room, a mark so small it had seemed trivial at the time. Now, in the quiet of the streets, he wondered if it was truly trivial or a deliberate signpost for someone clever enough to notice, a subtle signal from the orchestrator, the mastermind, or even an entirely separate mind waiting in the wings. The uncertainty was satisfying in its own way. It affirmed the endless complexity of human behavior, the layers of concealment, and the intricate dance of control and observation that defined true mystery. Delacroix's pace quickened as he moved through the narrow alleyways, the gas lamps casting elongated shadows on the cobblestones. Each step was deliberate, observant, attuned to nuance. He noticed a shop window where a display had been subtly rearranged, a figurine slightly off-centre, a book turned to an unusual page. Perhaps coincidence, or perhaps another faint signature in a game that had extended beyond the confines of the Rousseau household. His mind catalogued it, filed it, ready to follow if patterns emerged. The city's hum rose around him, a quiet reminder that life moved forward, yet that mysteries never truly concluded. Delacroix understood this acutely. Resolution was rarely absolute. Even the most brilliant solution carried the possibility of unseen threads, additional layers of deception, or the lingering influence of a mind that had chosen to remain just out of reach. Each case was a living organism, its patterns shifting subtly with each observation, each interaction, each misstep or insight. He paused once more near the riverbank, the lights of the city shimmering in the water. The faint whisper of wind carried with it the faint scent of ink and old paper, subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to remind him that clues were everywhere for those trained to notice. He unfolded the note again, letting the words imprint in his mind. Patterns are never complete. Observe the silence between steps. It was a warning, an invitation, and a challenge all at once, a subtle reminder that a mystery once awakened never truly sleeps. Delacroix smiled faintly, the corners of his lips curling with a mixture of amusement and anticipation. Justice had been served in the immediate sense, the manipulations revealed, and the compulsion exposed. Yet he knew that the faintest anomalies, the cryptic signals, and the whispers of unseen minds ensured that the story was far from over. There would always be another case, another pattern to decode, another hidden hand to confront. With deliberate steps, he walked along the Seine, the city stretching ahead like a living puzzle, intricate and infinite. The resolution of the Rousseau household was a chapter closed, but the faint traces of remaining mysteries, the subtle imprints of cunning minds, and the infinite permutations of human behavior promised that no conclusion was ever permanent. The detective's mind worked relentlessly, cataloguing, interpreting, and anticipating, aware that the next subtle clue, the next hidden pattern, could arrive at any moment. And as he vanished into the foggy Parisian night, a quiet certainty lingered. Mysteries never truly end. They only evolve, shift, and whisper their secrets to those willing to listen carefully, observe patiently, and think one step ahead. For Delacroix, that was the true measure of his work, the endless pursuit, the eternal game of deduction and perception, and the delicate knowledge that, no matter how brilliantly a case seemed solved, somewhere just beyond reach, another puzzle awaited, subtle, intricate, and irresistible. And in that eternal chase, he was, and always would be, several steps ahead. See,